A sound pierced the dawn mist, chittering, urgent, a sound Mason Miller hadn't heard in exactly 1 year. His weathered hand froze on the porch railing, coffee cup suspended midair. That distinctive call had filled his cabin for months before he'd said goodbye, before he'd watched them disappear into the North Carolina forest's embrace. His heart hammered against his ribs as he set down his cup with trembling fingers. Rusty, his aging retriever, whined softly beside him, ears perked toward the tree line. "It can't be," Mason whispered, voice cracking like autumn leaves underfoot. The cry came again, more desperate now, almost pleading. Mason squinted through the golden morning light, breath catching in his throat. There, at the edge of his property, stood not just Bandit, but something that made his arthritic knees buckle beneath him. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Mason Miller had never planned to spend his 72nd year in the company of wild animals. After 47 years of marriage, 14 months of watching cancer steal Emily's vitality inch by inch, and a lifetime working as a wildlife photographer, he'd expected his final chapter to unfold in quiet solitude among the whispering pines of his small cabin near Pisgah National Forest. The cabin itself, weathered cedar with a stone chimney that smoked in the winter, had been their retirement dream, purchased with decades of savings from magazine shoots and teaching photography workshops. Now it stood as both sanctuary and prison, every corner haunted by Emily's absence. Her gardening gloves still hung by the back door. Her favorite teacup remained unwashed in the sink some days when the grief pressed too heavily on Mason's chest. Most mornings followed the same ritual: coffee at dawn on the east-facing porch, a slow walk with Rusty, the golden retriever now gray around the muzzle, and hours spent staring through his camera lens at birds and deer, capturing images he no longer sold or shared. The photographs piled up on memory cards, digital ghosts of days that blurred together in endless succession. "You need to consider the alternatives, Dad," his son Thomas had said during his last visit. Insurance brochures for assisted living facilities spread across the kitchen table like fallen leaves. "This place is too much for you to manage alone." Mason had responded with stony silence. Thomas, with his accounting firm in Charlotte and 2 teenage daughters who rarely called their grandfather, couldn't understand what leaving would mean. This cabin held the last echoes of Emily's laughter, the familiar creak in the hallway floorboards, the view she'd loved from their bedroom window. Financially, Thomas wasn't wrong. Mason's photography royalties had dwindled, and Social Security stretched only so far. The property taxes increased yearly while the cabin's maintenance needs grew more demanding. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the heating system wheezed through winter like an old man climbing stairs. Dr. Patterson had added his own concerns during Mason's last checkup in town. "Your blood pressure's up, Mason, and you've lost weight again." The doctor had peered over reading glasses. "Are you eating regular meals? Talking to anyone besides Rusty?" Mason had deflected with practiced ease, promising improvements he had no intention of making. What was the point? Without Emily, the days stretched empty before him like the long forest road leading to his cabin, winding, solitary, and ultimately leading nowhere that mattered. It was on one of those aimless morning walks with Rusty, just as the dogwoods had begun to blossom, that Mason's carefully constructed isolation cracked open, making space for something unexpected to enter his diminished world. The dogwood blossoms dotted the forest like scattered clouds on that spring morning when Mason's life changed course. He hadn't intended to venture far from the cabin. His knees protested more with each passing year, but Rusty had caught a scent that sent him bounding deeper into the woods, leaving Mason no choice but to follow at his halting pace. "Rusty, get back here, you old fool," Mason called, his voice startling a pair of cardinals from a nearby branch. The walking stick Emily had carved for him years ago, oak with a handle worn smooth by his grip, sank into the soft earth with each labored step. The morning dew had soaked through his worn boots, and irritation prickled at his consciousness. Rusty knew better than to run off. He found the dog whining and pawing at a fallen oak, its massive trunk split where lightning had struck during last month's thunderstorm. Mason approached slowly, wary of snakes that might have made a home in the decaying wood. "What have you found, boy?" he asked, the annoyance in his voice giving way to curiosity. Rusty was too well trained to react this way to a squirrel or rabbit. The dog looked back at him with urgent eyes, then resumed his frantic pawing. That's when Mason heard it, a faint, distressed chittering sound coming from inside the hollow trunk. Carefully setting his walking stick aside, he lowered himself to his knees with a grunt and peered into the dark cavity. A pair of eyes gleamed back at him, reflecting terror and pain in equal measure. Mason reached for the small flashlight he kept in his jacket pocket. Emily's insistence on being prepared had become habit, and shone it into the darkness. The beam illuminated a raccoon, its fur matted with blood along one hind leg, trapped where the fallen trunk had created a narrow pocket. As the light shifted, Mason saw the unmistakable swollen belly of pregnancy. "Well now," he murmured, sitting back on his heels. "You're in a fine mess, aren't you?" The raccoon hissed weakly, attempting to retreat further into the hollowed trunk, but unable to move much due to its injury and the confined space. Mason's first instinct was to leave it be. Wild animals were unpredictable, especially when injured, and raccoons could carry rabies. Emily had been the animal lover between them. He had merely been the one to photograph them. "Come on, Rusty," he said, beginning to rise. "Nothing we can do here." But as he turned to leave, Emily's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, "Everything alive deserves compassion, Mason." It was something she'd said countless times during their years together, whether finding injured birds or relocating spiders from their bathroom. He paused, looking back at the frightened creature. The raccoon's breathing was rapid and shallow. Without help, it would likely die here, along with any offspring it carried. Mason sighed, feeling the weight of Emily's absence and the pull of her persistent kindness. "Your mama would have my hide if I left you here," he told the raccoon, deciding. Mason removed his worn canvas jacket, wincing as his shoulders protested the movement. He laid it on the ground beside him and reached into his pants pocket, retrieving a package of beef jerky he'd brought for his morning snack. Breaking off a small piece, he cautiously extended it toward the raccoon. "Come on now, I'm trying to help you." The raccoon regarded the offering with suspicion, whiskers twitching as it caught the scent. After a moment's hesitation, hunger apparently overcoming fear, it stretched forward and snatched the jerky with dexterous paws, retreating quickly to consume it. Mason continued offering small pieces, each time with the raccoon venturing slightly farther out of its wooden prison. After the fourth piece, he judged the animal close enough to attempt what he had in mind. In one swift movement that belied his age, he tossed the jacket over the raccoon and gently but firmly gathered the bundle, mindful of the injured leg. The raccoon thrashed and chittered in panic, but Mason held firm, speaking in the same soothing tone he'd once used with frightened horses on a Montana photo shoot decades ago. "Easy now, easy. I'm not going to hurt you." By the time he'd secured the makeshift bundle, his heart was racing and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Rusty watched with tilted head as Mason awkwardly rose to his feet, precious cargo cradled against his chest, walking stick forgotten beside the fallen tree. "Come on, boy. We've got work to do." The walk back to the cabin took twice as long, each step measured to avoid jostling his injured passenger. Inside the jacket, the raccoon had gone eerily still, either from fear or resignation. Mason could feel its rapid heartbeat against his palm. As they approached the cabin, his neighbor Nancy Jenkins was outside checking her mailbox. Her eyes widened at the sight of Mason cradling the bundle, his pants muddied at the knees. "Mason Miller, what in heaven's name have you got there?" she called, one hand shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Nothing to concern yourself with, Nancy," he replied, not slowing his pace. Nancy, a retired schoolteacher whose late husband had been the county veterinarian, was not so easily dismissed. She closed her mailbox and crossed to the property line, her practical gardening shoes crunching on the gravel drive. "Is that an animal? You know better than to bring wild creatures home, Mason. Especially raccoons. They carry all sorts of diseases." Mason felt a flash of irritation. "It's injured and pregnant. I'm just going to patch it up and let it go." Nancy's expression softened slightly, but concern still lined her face. "At least let me take a look. Charles taught me a thing or two about wildlife." Against his better judgment, Mason had never been one to accept help easily. He nodded. "Come on, then. But I'm not getting rid of it." In the cabin's mudroom, Mason gently laid the bundle on an old towel spread across the washing machine. With Nancy watching carefully from a safe distance, he slowly unwrapped his jacket. The raccoon, exhausted and injured, made no attempt to escape, its dark eyes tracking every movement. "Female, definitely pregnant," Nancy confirmed. "That leg needs cleaning, but I don't see any signs of rabies. No excessive drooling, clear eyes. Still, you should be careful." Mason nodded, relieved. "I've got some of Emily's first aid supplies in the bathroom." While he gathered hydrogen peroxide, antibiotic ointment, and gauze, Nancy continued her assessment. "She's going to need somewhere safe to have those babies, Mason, and a proper diet, not jerky," she added, spotting the package peeking from his pocket. "What do they eat, then?" Mason asked, returning with the supplies. "Fruits, vegetables, nuts? They're omnivores, but not primarily meat eaters. That jerky's too salty and processed, not good for her or the babies." Mason felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't thought about proper nutrition, just getting the animal to trust him enough for rescue. Together, they cleaned the raccoon's wound, a deep gash likely caused by the splintered wood, applied ointment, and loosely wrapped the leg. Throughout the process, Mason spoke softly to the creature, surprised at how still it remained under their ministrations. "You'll need to keep her contained somewhere," Nancy said when they finished. "A large dog crate would work temporarily." "I've got Emily's old photography equipment cases in the shed," Mason replied. "Might be able to rig something up on the back porch." Nancy gave him a searching look. "This is a big undertaking, Mason. Are you sure you're up for it?" The question stung more than he cared to admit. Since Emily's death, everyone from Thomas to Dr. Patterson seemed to question his capabilities. He straightened his stooped shoulders. "I've spent 50 years documenting wildlife. Think I can handle one injured raccoon." Nancy raised her hands in surrender. "All right, then. I'll bring over some appropriate food later. And Mason?" She paused at the door. "Emily would approve." After she left, Mason stood looking down at the raccoon, which had curled into a protective ball around its swollen abdomen. "Guess I should call you something," he murmured. The distinctive black mask across its face caught his eye. "Bandit, maybe? That suit you?" The raccoon, Bandit, blinked slowly, whiskers twitching. Over the next few days, Mason transformed his covered back porch into a makeshift raccoon recovery ward. He emptied Emily's largest equipment case, lined it with old towels, and cut a small doorway that could be secured at night. He set up a nesting box in one corner, filled with soft fabric scraps from Emily's quilting supplies. Following Nancy's advice, he provided fresh water and appropriate food, berries from the freezer, chopped apples, unsalted nuts, and the occasional hard-boiled egg. Each morning and evening, Mason checked Bandit's wound, changed the dressing, and spoke to her in the same quiet tone he'd once reserved for conversations with Emily. Rusty maintained a cautious distance, watching the proceedings from the kitchen doorway with wary eyes. Word of Mason's unusual houseguest spread quickly through the small community. Some neighbors, like Nancy, offered help and advice. Others made their disapproval known with pointed comments about wildlife regulations and disease control. When Ranger Steve Donnelly from the Forest Service stopped by, just checking in, Mason knew someone had reported him. "You know, it's technically illegal to keep wildlife without proper permits," Steve said, accepting a cup of coffee as they sat on the front porch, away from Bandit's enclosure. "Not keeping her," Mason replied. "Rehabilitating her. There's a difference." Steve sighed, running a hand through his short brown hair. "Mason, there are licensed wildlife rehabilitators for this kind of situation. Nearest one is an hour away. She wouldn't have made it." The ranger studied Mason's face. "This means a lot to you, doesn't it?" Mason looked away, uncomfortable with the question that probed too close to the empty spaces Emily had left behind. Just seemed like the right thing to do. That evening, alone except for Rusty and his recuperating raccoon, Mason took Emily's photograph from the bedside table and carried it to his worn leather armchair. The silver frame caught the lamplight as he traced her smiling face with a calloused finger. "Not sure what I've gotten myself into, Em," he said to the photograph. "Thomas would say I've finally lost my mind." He glanced toward the back porch, where Bandit was cautiously exploring her expanded enclosure. "Maybe I have, but it feels good to have something that needs me again." In the photograph, Emily's eyes seemed to twinkle with understanding, the way they always had when she knew something he hadn't yet figured out for himself. 3 weeks after finding Bandit, Mason woke to the sound of his own ragged breathing. Darkness pressed around him, the familiar weight of Rusty absent from the foot of the bed. A sharp pain radiated down his left arm, and cold sweat dampened his pajamas. The red numbers on his bedside clock glowed 3:17 a.m. "Not now," he whispered to the empty room, pressing his right hand against his chest. The pain receded slightly, but a persistent ache remained. Through the open bedroom window, he heard a distressed chittering from the back porch. Bandit. Mason forced himself to take slow, deep breaths, like Dr. Patterson had instructed during his last episode. He fumbled for the prescription bottle in his nightstand, swallowed a nitroglycerin tablet dry, and waited for it to dissolve under his tongue. The minutes stretched as he listened to Bandit's increasingly agitated sounds. When the worst of the pain subsided, Mason swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for his robe. His fingers trembled as he tied the belt around his waist. He should call an ambulance, that's what Emily would insist upon, but the raccoon's distress calls drew him toward the back of the cabin. He found Rusty standing at attention outside the porch door, whining softly. Inside, Bandit was pacing her enclosure, moving with more agility than she had since her rescue. Her leg had healed remarkably well, though she still favored it slightly. Mason flipped on the porch light and approached the enclosure. "What's got you all worked up, girl?" he asked, voice rough with lingering pain. Bandit pressed against the wire mesh, dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. She chittered again, more urgently, then retreated to the nesting box where she began frantically rearranging the fabric scraps. "Good Lord," Mason muttered, the realization dawning. "It's time, isn't it?" He'd read about raccoon births during his late-night research sessions on Nancy's borrowed laptop, but hadn't expected it quite this soon. Raccoons typically gave birth about 63 days after mating, with litters ranging from 2 to 5 kits. By his estimation, Bandit was still a week away from delivery. Mason's hand drifted back to his chest where a dull ache persisted. He should call for help, for himself, not just Bandit. The sensible course would be to call Nancy, who lived just down the road, or even Ranger Steve, who had grudgingly provided his personal number in case of emergency. Instead, Mason lowered himself into the wicker chair beside Bandit's enclosure and reached for his cell phone. His finger hovered over Nancy's name before switching to an internet search, Raccoon labor signs. For the next hour, Mason alternated between monitoring his own pulse and watching Bandit's increasingly purposeful preparations. The pain in his chest gradually faded to a manageable discomfort, but his concern for Bandit grew. She seemed agitated, unable to settle, periodically returning to the mesh to stare at him with those intelligent eyes. At 4:45 a.m., as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Mason made a decision. Setting aside caution and conventional wisdom, he unlatched the door to Bandit's enclosure. She immediately emerged, but instead of attempting escape, she circled around Mason's legs once, then moved with determination toward the cabin door. "You want inside?" Mason asked incredulously. Bandit paused at the threshold, looking back at him expectantly. Rusty, who had maintained a respectful distance from the raccoon since her arrival, whined softly but made no move to intervene. Against every reasonable argument, Mason opened the door. "Your mama would say I've completely lost my mind," he told Rusty as Bandit waddled into the cabin. With surprising purpose, the raccoon navigated through the kitchen and down the hallway, her claws clicking on the hardwood floors. Mason followed, bemused and concerned in equal measure. When she reached the closed door of Emily's sewing room, untouched since her death, Bandit rose on her hind legs and scratched at the wood. Mason hesitated. He hadn't entered that room in 14 months. Emily's half-finished quilt still lay draped across her sewing table, her reading glasses resting atop pattern pieces as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second. Bandit scratched more insistently, a soft whimper escaping her. All right," Mason said, reaching past her to turn the knob. The room smelled faintly of Emily's lavender sachets and the lemon furniture polish she'd favored. Moonlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the floor. Bandit moved directly to the cedar chest beneath the window, Emily's storage for completed quilts, and attempted to climb atop it. Understanding dawned on Mason. "You want up there?" He lifted the raccoon carefully, surprised at how much weight she had gained under his care, and placed her on the chest. Bandit immediately began pulling at the folded quilt on top, a blue and white pattern Emily had called Ocean Waves. "Now hold on," Mason protested, but Bandit was determined. She tugged until the quilt partially unfolded, then arranged it into a nest-like depression. Only when she had settled into this improvised nest did she look back at Mason, her message clear. "This is where I'm staying." Mason ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Emily would either laugh herself silly or chase us both out with a broom," he told Bandit. But something about the raccoon's choice touched him deeply. Of all the places in the cabin, she had chosen Emily's sacred space, her creative sanctuary. "Guess we're doing this then," he sighed, pulling Emily's sewing chair close to the cedar chest. "But that quilt was for our granddaughter's graduation, so try not to make too much of a mess." As the sun rose, casting golden light through the lace curtains, Mason maintained his vigil beside Bandit. He'd called Nancy at a reasonable hour, explaining the situation in a voice that brooked no argument. She'd promised to come by mid-morning with supplies, her tone suggesting she had plenty to say about his decision but would save it for later. Shortly after 9, Bandit's labor intensified. Mason, who had witnessed countless wildlife births through his camera lens but never from such proximity, found himself murmuring encouragement as she panted and strained. "You're doing fine, girl. Just fine." The first kit arrived at 9:37 a.m., tiny, blind, and covered in fine gray fur. Bandit immediately set to cleaning the newborn, her movements gentle and practiced. Mason watched in awe as the tiny creature, no larger than a walnut, found its way to nurse. By noon, 3 more kits had joined the first, each following the same pattern of arrival: maternal cleaning and nursing. Bandit seemed exhausted but alert, her attention divided between her newborns and Mason, who hadn't left his post except to fetch water for himself and fresh fruit for her. When Nancy arrived, she found them thus: Mason dozing in the sewing chair, Bandit curled protectively around 4 nursing kits on Emily's prized quilt, and Rusty lying guard at the doorway. "Well, I never," she said, loudly enough to wake Mason. Her arms were laden with supplies: towels, a box lined with fleece, and a bag of fresh berries and nuts. Mason blinked groggily, wincing as he straightened in the chair. His chest still ached dully, a reminder of the night's cardiac episode that he had no intention of mentioning to Nancy. "She picked the spot," he said defensively, nodding toward Bandit and her kits. Nancy set down her supplies and approached cautiously, examining the new family from a respectful distance. "4 healthy kits from the look of it. You're lucky. First-time raccoon mothers sometimes lose their litters, especially under stress." "Nothing stressful about Emily's sewing room," Mason replied. "Most peaceful place in the house." Nancy's expression softened. "She'd be tickled to have raccoon babies on her quilt, wouldn't she?" Mason nodded, unexpected emotion tightening his throat. "She named every squirrel in the yard. Imagine what she'd make of this." Nancy turned her attention to Mason, her nurse's eye assessing. "You look awful. Did you sleep at all?" "Enough." He shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Had a bit of heartburn in the night, that's all." "Heartburn?" she repeated skeptically. "Mason Miller, if you're having cardiac symptoms again—" "I took the medicine," he interrupted. "It passed. I'm fine." Nancy crossed her arms. "Is that why you're holding your left shoulder like it's made of glass?" Before Mason could formulate a denial, a knock at the front door interrupted them. Rusty barked once, then fell silent at Mason's command. "That'll be Ranger Steve," Nancy explained. "I called him on my way over. Thought we might need an expert opinion." Mason scowled. "You had no right." "I had every right as your friend and neighbor," she countered. "And you know it." The ranger entered the sewing room moments later, his uniform crisp despite the casual setting. He nodded a greeting to Mason before focusing on Bandit and her kits. "Well now, looks like congratulations are in order," he said, crouching to observe without touching. 4 healthy kits, that's a good-sized litter." Mason grunted acknowledgement, still annoyed at Nancy's interference but too tired to maintain his irritation. "What happens now?" Steve straightened, choosing his words carefully. "Technically, I should report this. Legally, you need permits for wildlife rehabilitation." "She came to me injured," Mason said. "Was I supposed to let her die?" "No," Steve conceded. "But there are protocols." "Protocols be damned," Mason interrupted. "She's a mother now. Those babies need her, and she needs peace and quiet, not bureaucratic nonsense." Nancy and Steve exchanged glances, a silent communication that Mason recognized all too well. The look people gave when they thought he was being unreasonable in his grief or age. "Look," Steve said finally, "I can help you navigate this properly. There's a middle ground between turning a blind eye and removing them from your care." Mason leaned forward, wincing as the movement triggered another twinge in his chest. "What kind of middle ground?" "A temporary rehabilitation permit. I can help with the paperwork. You document their progress, follow proper protocols for minimal human contact, and prepare for eventual release when the kits are old enough." "And if I refuse?" Steve's expression remained neutral. "Then I'd have to report this to Wildlife Services, and they'd remove the raccoons to a licensed facility." The thought of Bandit and her newborns being taken away sent a spike of panic through Mason that had nothing to do with his heart condition. In the weeks since finding her, the raccoon had become more than a project. She represented purpose, a reason to rise each morning that didn't revolve around memories and regret. "How long?" Mason asked. How long before they'd be ready for release? Raccoon kits stay with their mother for about 9 months, Steve replied. They'll be dependent on her milk for about 2 months, then she'll teach them to forage. By late fall, they should be ready. 9 months. Long enough to see them through spring and summer into autumn. Long enough to document their growth and development with his cameras. Long enough, perhaps, to find his way through the worst of his grief with the strange comfort of their presence. I'll do it properly, Mason decided. Whatever paperwork you need. The relief on Nancy's face was palpable. Good. Now, while Steve starts on that, let's talk about your heart, Mason. And don't you dare tell me it was just heartburn. 3 days later, Mason sat on his front porch, paperwork spread across the small table beside him. His new cardiac medication, prescribed after Nancy had practically dragged him to Dr. Patterson's office, made him slightly dizzy but had eased the chronic ache in his chest. Bandit and her kits had been relocated to a proper enclosure that Steve had helped construct in the sewing room, now officially designated as a temporary wildlife rehabilitation space. The phone call from Thomas had been less pleasant than the doctor's visit. A raccoon, Dad? In Mom's sewing room? His son's voice had carried equal parts concern and exasperation. Nancy says you had another heart episode. This is exactly why we talked about Whispering Pines retirement community. Had it under control, Mason had replied, and Bandit needed a safe place for her babies. Bandit, Thomas had repeated flatly. You named it. Her, Mason had corrected. And yes, seemed appropriate given the mask marking. The conversation had deteriorated from there, ending with Thomas's promise to visit in 2 weeks to assess the situation personally. Mason knew what that meant. Another round of brochures, another speech about being practical, another reminder that he was old and alone and apparently incapable of sound decision-making. As he signed the last of Steve's permit forms, Mason glanced up to see Nancy approaching along the gravel drive, a covered dish in her hands. "Thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal," she called. "It's Charles's venison stew recipe." Mason nodded his thanks, making space for her on the porch swing. Nancy had been a constant presence since Bandit's delivery, bringing food, helping with the kits, and discreetly monitoring Mason's health without directly mentioning his heart. "They're doing well," he told her as she settled beside him. "All 4 nursing regularly, good weight gain according to the chart Steve provided." "And how about their caretaker?" Nancy asked, studying his face. "You're looking a bit more rested." Mason shrugged. "New medication helps with the pain, still makes me dizzy in the mornings. That should pass as your body adjusts." Nancy hesitated, then added, "Thomas called me yesterday." Of course he had. Mason suppressed a flash of irritation. "Checking up on me?" "He's worried, Mason. That's what family does." "Worry from Charlotte is easy. Understanding what matters to me would be more helpful." Nancy sighed. "He's coming from a place of love, even if it doesn't feel that way." Mason didn't respond. The complicated relationship with his son, strained by distance, different values, and the shadow of Emily's long illness wasn't something he cared to dissect with Nancy, despite her good intentions. Instead, he changed the subject. "Steve thinks we should start documenting the kit's development, for the permit requirements, but also as an educational resource." He nodded toward his camera, sitting ready on the porch railing. "Thought I might set up in the sewing room this afternoon, get some proper photographs." Nancy smiled. "Emily would love that, using your talent to help people understand these creatures better." For the first time in many months, Mason felt a spark of professional interest. Might need to order some specialized equipment, proper lighting that won't disturb them, maybe a new macro lens for detail shots of their development. "Sounds expensive?" Nancy observed cautiously. Mason waved away the concern. "Got some savings. Might as well use it for something worthwhile." What he didn't mention was that the savings included the money Thomas had earmarked for the retirement community deposit. His son couldn't understand that documenting Bandit's family had awakened something in Mason that he'd thought died with Emily. Purpose. That evening, as Mason carefully positioned his camera equipment in the sewing room, keeping a respectful distance from the Raccoon family, he found himself talking to Emily as if she were standing beside him. "Remember that wolf den in Yellowstone, Em? 3 cubs, and the mother who let us set up just close enough for the telephoto? This is better, right here in your sewing room. Wait till you see what I can capture with the right setup." Bandit watched him with alert eyes as he worked, neither fearful nor particularly concerned by his presence. The kits, still blind but growing rapidly, squeaked and squirmed against her belly. As Mason adjusted his tripod, a sharp rap at the front door broke his concentration. Rusty barked once in response. "Coming," Mason called, carefully backing out of the sewing room. He wasn't expecting visitors, and Nancy would have called first. When he opened the door, Ranger Steve stood on the porch, his expression uncharacteristically grave. Behind him, an official Forest Service vehicle was parked beside a black SUV Mason didn't recognize. "Evening, Mason," Steve said. "Sorry to drop by unannounced, but we have a situation. This is Dr. Lydia Carlson from the State Wildlife Commission." The woman beside Steve stepped forward, offering her hand. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that assessed Mason with clinical interest. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I understand you're rehabilitating a female raccoon and her newborn kits?" Mason's stomach tightened with apprehension. "That's right. Got the temporary permit process started with Ranger Donnelly here?" Dr. Carlson nodded. "May we come in?" "I'd like to examine the animals and discuss some concerns that have been raised." Mason stepped aside reluctantly, allowing them into his living room. "What concerns?" "They're doing fine, following all the protocols Steve provided." Steve and Dr. Carlson exchanged glances before the ranger spoke. "There's been a report, Mason. Someone in the community expressed concern about your health status and ability to properly care for wildlife." The implication hit Mason like a physical blow. Someone had reported him, questioned his competence because of his age or health. The betrayal stung, though he couldn't decide who might have done it. Nancy, one of the disapproving neighbors, or had Thomas made a call from Charlotte? "My health is fine," Mason said stiffly. "Ask Dr. Patterson if you don't believe me." "It's not just that," Dr. Carlson interjected smoothly. "There are concerns about the level of habituation. Allowing a wild raccoon to choose a birthing location inside your home, for instance, indicates a concerning level of human-wildlife boundary crossing." Mason's jaw tightened. "She was injured, pregnant. I provided a safe space." "With all due respect, Mr. Miller, safe spaces for wildlife shouldn't include quilts and sewing rooms," Dr. Carlson replied. "May I see them now?" For a moment, Mason considered refusing. The thought of this stranger evaluating Bandit and her kits, judging his care, potentially deciding to remove them, made his newly medicated heart race uncomfortably. But Steve's sympathetic expression suggested cooperation would be wiser than resistance. "This way," Mason said tersely, leading them down the hallway. In the sewing room, Bandit raised her head alertly as they entered, instinctively shifting to shield her kits from the strangers, Doctor. Carlson approached the enclosure with professional interest, nodding approvingly at the setup while making notes on a tablet. "Proper nesting materials, appropriate food and water, adequate space," she murmured. 4 kits, approximately 3 days old, all appear to be nursing well. She turned to Mason. "You've done well with the physical setup, Mr. Miller, but I remain concerned about the level of attachment forming here, on both sides." "Meaning?" Mason challenged. meaning these are wild animals that will eventually return to their natural habitat. The more comfortable they become with humans, the less likely they are to survive that transition. Steve stepped forward. Dr. Carlson, Mason understands the goal is release. We've discussed proper protocols to minimize habituation while ensuring the kit's survival. The wildlife veterinarian considered this. I'd like to see documentation of your plans. Feeding schedules, observation protocols, habituation prevention measures, and release preparation timeline. I can provide those, Steve offered before Mason could respond. We're working on the formal paperwork now. Dr. Carlson nodded. I'll need to make follow-up visits to monitor progress. And, Mr. Miller, she added, turning to face him directly, I need your assurance that you understand these animals are not pets. They are temporary wards of the state under your rehabilitative care. The condescension in her tone ignited a flare of anger in Mason's chest. Been photographing wildlife for 50 years, Dr. Carlson. I know the difference between wild and domestic better than most. Her expression remained impassive. Then we understand each other. I'll schedule a follow-up in 2 weeks. Please ensure all documentation is in order by then. After they departed, Mason stood in the doorway of the sewing room, watching Bandit settle back into her maternal duties. The raccoon's dark eyes met his with what he couldn't help interpreting as shared indignation. Bureaucrats, he told her with a sigh. Emily never had much patience for them either. Despite the unwelcome visit, Mason felt a renewed determination. He would follow every protocol, document every development, create a rehabilitation program so exemplary that even Dr. Carlson would have to approve. And when the time came for release, he would ensure Bandit and her family were prepared for their return to the wild. But first, he needed to discover who had reported him and why. 2 weeks after Dr. Carlson's unexpected visit, Mason's sewing room had transformed into a wildlife documentation studio. His old photography equipment, long dormant in storage, now surrounded the raccoon enclosure. Tripods supporting 3 different cameras, each set to capture specific aspects of Bandit and her growing family. Softboxes modified to produce gentle, non-disturbing light, and a digital recording system that tracked movement throughout the day and night. The kits, now with open eyes and increasingly active bodies, had begun exploring their enclosure under Bandit's watchful supervision. Mason had named them according to their emerging personalities. Scout, the first to venture from the nest, Rascal, the most vocal, Peanut, the smallest, and Emily, the female kit with unusually light markings around her eyes that reminded Mason of his wife's gentle gaze. They've doubled in size, he told Nancy, who had stopped by with fresh blueberries from her garden. Scout's already trying to climb the mesh walls. Nancy peered through the doorway, careful not to enter without Mason's permission, a courtesy he appreciated since Dr. Carlson's visit. They grow up fast. Charles used to say wild things live their whole lives at triple speed compared to us humans. Mason nodded, adjusting the aperture on his macro lens to capture Peanut's tiny paws as the kit batted at a dangling twig. Been thinking about that release timeline Steve and Dr. Carlson keep talking about. 9 months seems arbitrary. In the wild, some kits stay with their mother through the first winter. You're not getting attached, are you? Nancy asked, her tone carefully neutral. Mason snorted. Course not. I'm being scientific. Proper rehabilitation means releasing them when they're ready, not according to some bureaucrat's calendar. Nancy didn't press the point, but her skeptical expression spoke volumes. Thomas called again yesterday. Wanted to know if you've reconsidered Whispering Pines. Told him my answer when he visited last week. Mason's jaw tightened at the memory of his son's brief, tense visit. Thomas standing stiffly in the sewing room doorway, barely glancing at the Raccoon family before launching into another lecture about appropriate living arrangements and quality of life in senior years. He worries, Nancy said, echoing her constant refrain. Especially after that heart episode. I'm on medication now. Blood pressure's down. Dr. Patterson says I'm doing fine. Mason turned back to his camera, a clear signal that the conversation was over. After Nancy left, Mason settled into the rocking chair he'd moved into the sewing room for his observation sessions. Bandit had grown accustomed to his presence, neither seeking interaction nor showing distress when he moved quietly around the room. The careful distance maintained between human observer and wild subject satisfied even Dr. Carlson's strict protocols, at least officially. What Mason didn't document in his meticulous notes was how Bandit watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. How she seemed to recognize his footsteps in the hallway, distinct from Nancy's or Steve's. How she would position herself between strangers and her kits, but relaxed her guard when it was just Mason in the room. He also didn't document his one-sided conversations with her. While adjusting camera angles or refreshing food and water, Mason found himself talking to Bandit as naturally as he'd once talked to Emily, about the weather, about the neighbor's noisy new ATV, about Thomas's stubborn insistence that Mason couldn't manage on his own. "Boy never did understand this place," he told Bandit one evening as he changed the memory card in his time-lapse camera. "City born and raised, Emily's idea to move him to Charlotte for those fancy schools turned him into a stranger." Bandit chittered softly from her perch atop the nesting box, where she often sat watching her increasingly mobile kits explore their enclosure. "Guess that's not fair," Mason conceded, as if she'd offered a counter-argument. "He's doing what he thinks is right, just like his mama would." The days developed a comfortable rhythm, mornings spent checking the overnight footage and refreshing the Raccoon family's supplies. Afternoons dedicated to editing photographs and compiling observation notes for the state wildlife officials. Evenings spent quietly observing from his rocking chair, often with Rusty dozing at his feet. Ranger Steve visited weekly, reviewing Mason's documentation and offering suggestions for the eventual release plan. Dr. Carlson returned twice, each visit less confrontational than the last as she noted the kit's progress and Mason's adherence to protocol. At 6 weeks, the change in the Raccoon family was dramatic. The kits had grown from helpless, blind newborns to energetic, curious youngsters, their bodies covered in dense fur, their movements increasingly coordinated and purposeful. Scout, true to his name, had become the explorer, often the first to investigate new objects introduced to the enclosure. Rascal remained the vocal one, his distinctive chittering audible throughout the cabin. Peanut, though still the smallest, had developed a knack for problem-solving, figuring out puzzle feeders faster than his siblings. And Emily, the female kit, showed a gentle nature that reminded Mason painfully of his wife. Bandit had proven herself an attentive mother, gradually transitioning her kits from nursing to solid foods, demonstrating foraging behaviors with the fresh fruits, vegetables, and occasional insects that Mason provided. She maintained firm discipline, delivering swift but gentle corrections when the kits became too rambunctious or ventured too close to the enclosure boundaries. As Mason documented these behaviors, he found his photographer's eye reawakening after months of dormancy following Emily's death. He began experimenting with different lighting techniques, capturing intimate moments between mother and kits that revealed behaviors rarely observed in wild raccoons. His detailed notes, combined with high-quality photographs, exceeded the documentation requirements set by the Wildlife Commission. What had begun as an obligation to satisfy bureaucratic requirements gradually evolved into something more, a research project worthy of publication. When Mason mentioned this possibility to Ranger Steve during one of his visits, the younger man's enthusiasm was immediate. "These observations could be valuable, Mason. Most raccoon research happens in controlled laboratory settings or through distant field observation. This intimate documentation of maternal-kit interactions is unique. Mason hadn't considered the scientific value of his work. He'd simply been recording what he saw, as he'd done throughout his career. But Steve's interest sparked an idea that had been dormant since Emily's diagnosis had forced Mason's early retirement from professional photography. That evening, after refreshing Bandit's water supply, Mason retrieved his laptop from the living room and settled into his rocking chair. With Rusty curled at his feet and the Raccoon family settling down for the night, he navigated to the website of North American Wildlife Journal, where his photo essays had once been regularly featured. The magazine's submission guidelines had changed in the years since his last contribution, emphasizing digital content and multimedia presentations rather than traditional photo essays. But the editorial focus remained the same: authentic wildlife documentation combined with compelling narrative. Mason began drafting an outline, tentatively titled Maternal Behavior in Rehabilitated Procyon Lotor, a Case Study. The academic framing felt strange after years of more artistic work, but he persisted, organizing his observations into categories: nursing behaviors, discipline techniques, play facilitation, and environmental adaptation. He attached a selection of his best photographs, each meticulously captioned with date, time, and observed behavior. As he worked, Mason became aware of a soft scratching sound. Looking up from his laptop, he found Bandit watching him intently from her enclosure, one paw resting against the mesh. The kits were asleep in a pile, their small bodies rising and falling with synchronous breath. "Just writing about you," Mason told her quietly. "Might make people understand your kind better." Bandit tilted her head, her dark eyes reflecting the soft lamplight. For a moment, Mason could almost believe she understood, that this creature recognized the purpose behind his constant presence and documentation. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. The Wildlife Commission's protocols were clear: minimize anthropomorphizing, maintain objective distance, avoid creating dependency. Mason had followed these guidelines meticulously in his official reports. But in the privacy of the sewing room, with only Rusty as witness, he allowed himself to acknowledge the connection forming between observer and subject, a connection that transcended scientific detachment. His phone buzzed with an incoming call, breaking the moment. Thomas's name flashed on the screen. Mason sighed, setting aside his laptop to answer. "Evening, son?" "Dad?" Thomas's voice carried its usual undertone of concern and impatience. "How are you feeling?" "Fine. Blood pressure's steady." "Taking the pills like clockwork." "Good. Good." An awkward pause followed, filled with unasked questions and unvoiced concerns. "Listen, I've been thinking about your situation there." Mason braced himself for another retirement community pitch. "My situation is just fine, Thomas. Nancy mentioned you're spending most of your time with those raccoons now, taking pictures, keeping records. It's called wildlife rehabilitation. Got all the proper permits." "I know, and that's actually why I'm calling." Thomas's tone shifted, a note of enthusiasm replacing the usual concern. "I was talking to a colleague whose brother works for National Geographic. They might be interested in your project." Mason straightened in his chair, surprised by this unexpected turn. "National Geographic?" "They're doing a series on human-wildlife interactions. Citizen science, they're calling it. When I mentioned your Raccoon family and your photography background, he thought it might be a good fit." For a moment, Mason was speechless. National Geographic had been the pinnacle of wildlife photography during his active career, a publication he'd submitted to repeatedly but never quite broken into. "Would need to see what their terms are," he said finally, professional caution overriding his initial excitement. "Don't want anyone interfering with the rehabilitation protocol." "Of course," Thomas agreed quickly. "I'll have him send over the details. But Dad, this could be good. Getting back to your photography, doing something meaningful with it. The unspoken implication hung between them. Something more meaningful than sitting alone in a cabin talking to his dead wife's photograph. "I'll look at what they send," Mason conceded. "No promises." After ending the call, Mason sat in thoughtful silence, watching Bandit settle back into her nest with her kits. The prospect of National Geographic's interest stirred something he'd thought long buried: professional ambition. For decades, his wildlife photography had been more than a career. It had been his way of interpreting the world, of connecting with the wilderness that had always felt more like home than any human dwelling. Emily had understood this about him. On their first date, he'd shown her his portfolio instead of taking her to dinner and a movie like other young men might have done. She'd studied each photograph with genuine interest, asking questions about technique and subject that revealed her own deep appreciation for the natural world. Later, she'd become his most honest critic and staunchest supporter, traveling with him to remote locations, enduring discomfort and sometimes danger to help him capture the perfect image. What would she make of this raccoon family that had taken up residence in her sewing room? Of the hours he spent documenting their daily lives? Of National Geographic potentially being interested in his work again after all these years? "You'd say it's about time," he murmured to the empty space beside him. "You always did think I was selling myself short." The next morning, Mason woke to an unusual sound, a deep, rumbling growl from Rusty, who stood rigid at the bedroom doorway, his aging body tense with alertness. Dawn light filtered through the curtains as Mason reached for his glasses and robe. "What is it, boy?" he asked, the grogginess of sleep giving way to concern. Rusty continued growling, his focus directed down the hallway toward the sewing room. Mason followed cautiously, pausing to retrieve the flashlight he kept in the kitchen drawer, a habitual precaution from years of power outages in the rural area. As he approached the sewing room, Mason heard a distinct scratching sound, followed by a soft thud. Bandit and the kits should be secure in their enclosure. He'd checked the latches before bed as he did every night. Heart rate accelerating, he pushed the door open slowly. In the dim early light, he made out a shape that didn't belong. A second adult raccoon, larger than Bandit, investigating the exterior of the enclosure. The newcomer froze at Mason's entrance, dark eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight. "Well, I'll be damned," Mason whispered. Inside the enclosure, Bandit was fully alert, positioned protectively in front of her kits, who had awakened and were chittering excitedly. But her posture wasn't aggressive. She wasn't displaying the defensive behavior Mason would expect toward an intruder. The male raccoon, for it was clearly a male, larger, and with more prominent markings than Bandit, made no move to flee. Instead, it studied Mason with what appeared to be calculating intelligence, assessing the threat he might pose. Mason remained perfectly still, photographer's instinct overriding his surprise. The situation was unprecedented in his weeks of rehabilitation work. Wild raccoons were typically solitary, except during mating season, with males playing no role in rearing young. Yet here was a male, apparently drawn to Bandit and her kits despite their unusual living situation. Slowly, carefully, Mason backed out of the doorway. "Rusty, stay," he commanded softly, not wanting the dog to frighten away this unexpected visitor. Once in the hallway, he quickly retrieved one of his remote cameras from the living room cabinet and returned to set it up just inside the sewing room door. The male raccoon had moved closer to the enclosure, nose to nose with Bandit through the mesh, their whiskers almost touching. The kits crowded around their mother, clearly curious about the newcomer. Mason activated the camera's motion sensor and retreated again, pulling the door nearly closed but leaving enough space to observe. For the next hour, Mason watched a remarkable interaction unfold. The male raccoon circled the enclosure repeatedly, occasionally pawing at the mesh or chittering softly. Bandit followed his movements from inside, her initial wariness giving way to what Mason could only interpret as recognition. The kits mirrored their mother's behavior, their initial excitement settling into curious observation. When Ranger Steve arrived for his scheduled weekly visit later that morning, Mason met him on the porch, barely containing his excitement. "Got something you need to see," he said, leading Steve directly to the sewing room. The male raccoon had departed after sunrise, but Mason had hours of footage documenting the visit. As they reviewed the recordings on Mason's laptop, Steve's professional composure gave way to genuine amazement. "This is highly unusual behavior," he confirmed, studying the footage of the male's careful inspection of the enclosure. "Males typically have no interest in kits until they're nearly grown." "He wasn't aggressive," Mason pointed out. "Seemed more protective, like he was checking on them." Steve nodded slowly. "There have been some documented cases of male raccoons maintaining loose associations with females and offspring, particularly in environments with abundant resources. But this level of apparent interest in the family unit is remarkable." "Think he might be the father?" Mason asked. "Possibly. Or perhaps a related male, brother, previous offspring. Raccoon social structures aren't well documented in the wild." Steve looked up from the laptop, excitement evident in his expression. "This could be significant, Mason. Worth tracking for sure." Over the following weeks, the male raccoon, whom Mason named Guardian, returned regularly, always in the pre-dawn hours. Mason adjusted his documentation schedule to capture these visits, installing additional cameras and even a baby monitor to alert him to Guardian's arrivals. The raccoon family continued to develop according to schedule, with the kits growing more independent and adventurous by the day. At 8 weeks following Dr. Carlson's approval, Mason modified their enclosure to include an outdoor portion, a secure covered area on the back porch that allowed the raccoons access to natural elements while maintaining the protection of the rehabilitation protocol. Guardian's visits extended to this outdoor area, where Mason observed him demonstrating foraging behaviors that the kits watched attentively through the mesh. Bandit seemed to encourage this education, positioning her kits where they could best observe the male's techniques for turning over stones to find insects or washing food items in the water bowl Mason provided. The project that had begun as an act of impulsive compassion had evolved into a full-fledged research study, with Mason's documentation growing more sophisticated and detailed with each passing week. His submission to North American Wildlife Journal was accepted with enthusiasm, and Thomas's contact at National Geographic expressed interest in a feature story once the rehabilitation process was complete. For the first time since Emily's death, Mason found himself looking forward to each day, eager to document new behaviors, to process the previous night's footage, to share his observations with Steve and occasionally Dr. Carlson, whose initial skepticism had gradually transformed into professional respect. Even Thomas seemed impressed during his monthly visits, though he still raised occasional concerns about Mason's living situation. "It's good to see you engaged again, Dad," he admitted during a Sunday afternoon visit in late summer. "But what happens when they're gone? Have you thought about that?" Mason had thought about it, more than he cared to admit. The raccoon family had become the center of his daily routine, their presence filling the silence that had once echoed through the cabin's empty rooms. The prospect of their eventual release lingered at the edges of his consciousness, a necessary conclusion that he simultaneously prepared for and avoided contemplating too deeply. "I'll cross that bridge when I come to it," he told Thomas. "Got plenty to focus on till then." What Mason didn't share with his son, or with Nancy, Steve, or Dr. Carlson, were his private concerns about the raccoon family's readiness for release. Despite the outdoor enclosure and minimal human interaction, Bandit and her kits had been born or raised in captivity for nearly their entire lives. Guardian's visits provided some exposure to wild behaviors, but was it enough? Would they know how to find shelter, avoid predators, survive the coming winter? These questions haunted Mason as summer transitioned to early fall, the surrounding forest beginning its annual transformation from vibrant green to russet and gold. According to the Wildlife Commission's timeline, the raccoon family should be prepared for release by October, just 6 weeks away. One crisp September morning, as Mason reviewed his latest footage of Guardian's pre-dawn visit, a loud mechanical rumbling interrupted his concentration. Setting aside his laptop, he stepped onto the front porch to investigate, Rusty following at his heels. At the edge of his property, where his land bordered an undeveloped tract of forest, a line of heavy equipment had assembled: bulldozers, excavators, trucks bearing the logo of Davidson Development, Inc. A crew of workers in hard hats consulted blueprints spread across the hood of a pickup truck. Mason's stomach tightened with foreboding. The undeveloped land had been for sale for years, but the remote location and lack of infrastructure had deterred serious buyers. Until now, apparently. He approached the property line, where a man in a suit rather than workwear stood directing the operation. "Morning," Mason called. "Mind telling me what's happening here?" The man turned, offering a practiced smile and an extended hand. "James Davidson, Davidson Development. You must be Mr. Miller. We're just doing some preliminary survey work today." Mason ignored the outstretched hand. "Survey work for what, exactly?" Davidson's smile dimmed slightly. "Pine Ridge Estates. 30 luxury cabins with all the amenities. We closed on the property last week." The news hit Mason like a physical blow. 30 cabins meant roads, utilities, noise, light pollution, a complete transformation of the quiet forest that had been his and Emily's sanctuary for the past decade. It also meant a dramatic reduction in viable habitat for the local wildlife, including the raccoon family he was preparing for release. "This is a wildlife corridor," Mason said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "Bears, deer, foxes, they all move through here seasonally." Davidson's expression remained neutral, professional. "We've completed all required environmental assessments, Mr. Miller. Our development plans include green spaces and wildlife considerations." "Green spaces?" Mason repeated incredulously. "You mean the leftover patches between vacation rentals?" "I understand change can be concerning for long-time residents," Davidson replied, his tone taking on a patronizing edge that made Mason's blood pressure spike dangerously. "But Pine Ridge Estates will actually increase your property value significantly. Many of our residents might be interested in local wildlife photography tours." "I understand that's your specialty?" Mason turned away without responding, unwilling to risk the words that might emerge if he continued the conversation. Back inside the cabin, he immediately called Ranger Steve, pacing the living room as he explained the situation. "They can't just destroy that habitat, Steve. There's a wetland area that feeds the creek system, old-growth trees, denning sites." Steve's response was measured, sympathetic, but realistic. "If they've completed the required assessments and obtained permits, there's not much the Forest Service can do, Mason. Private property development falls under county jurisdiction." "So that's it. We just let them bulldoze critical habitat?" "Let me look into it," Steve promised. "There might be conservation easements or watershed protections we can leverage." "But Mason," he added cautiously, "this development could impact your release plans for Bandit's family. We might need to consider an alternate location, further from construction activity." After hanging up, Mason stood at his kitchen window, watching the survey crew marking boundaries with bright orange flags that stood out starkly against the autumn foliage. The timing couldn't be worse. Just as the raccoon family was approaching release age, their potential habitat was about to be dramatically altered. He thought of Guardian, who had established a territory that clearly included the land now marked for development. Of the kits, who would need protected space to practice their foraging and survival skills, of Bandit, who had trusted Mason's care during her most vulnerable time. The responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. Somehow, he needed to find a way to protect both his home and the creatures who had given it new purpose. That evening, as Mason sat in the sewing room documenting the kit's increasingly complex play behaviors, Nancy arrived with concerning news from town. "Davidson Development has been buying up properties all over the county," she reported, settling into the spare chair Mason had added to the room for visitors. "They've got plans for a whole network of vacation communities. Mayor's calling it a rural revitalization initiative." Mason grunted, adjusting his camera to capture Scout and Rascal's wrestling match. "More like a rural destruction initiative." Nancy watched the kit's antics with a small smile before continuing. "There's a town council meeting tomorrow night. Public comment period for the development plans. Thought Davidson said they already had all the permits. For preliminary work, yes. But the full development plan requires additional approvals." Nancy hesitated before adding, "You should come, Mason. Speak up about the wildlife impact." Mason hadn't attended a town meeting since Emily's diagnosis 3 years earlier. The thought of facing the crowded community center, presenting arguments against progress and economic development, made his chest tighten anxiously. What good would it do? Council's probably already counting their tax revenue. "Maybe," Nancy conceded. "But if no one speaks for the forest and its creatures, who will?" That night, Mason dreamed of Emily. They were walking their usual trail behind the cabin, the one that wound through stands of ancient hemlock and emerged at a small secret pond where wood ducks nested each spring. In the dream, Emily stopped suddenly, pointing ahead to where bulldozers advanced through the trees, their metal treads crushing undergrowth and saplings alike. "You can't let this happen, Mason," Dream Emily said, her voice as clear and determined as it had been in life. "This was our promise." He woke before dawn, the dream lingering with uncomfortable clarity. Their promise. The reason they'd spent their savings on this remote piece of land instead of a comfortable condo in Charlotte near Thomas and the grandchildren. They had promised each other and themselves to protect this small corner of wilderness for the creatures that had allowed Mason to build his career, capturing their images. As he made his morning coffee, Mason's gaze fell on Emily's gardening gloves, still hanging by the back door. She had been the activist between them, the one who wrote letters to editors and attended council meetings and organized conservation initiatives. Mason had been content to let his photographs speak for him, believing that showing people the beauty of wildlife was contribution enough. But photographs weren't enough now, not with bulldozers at his property line. With sudden decision, Mason retrieved his laptop and began composing an email to Thomas. He attached a selection of his most recent photographs: Bandit teaching her kits to wash food items, Guardian demonstrating how to pry bark from a log to find insects, the family group sleeping in a contented pile, their masked faces peaceful in slumber. "Son," he wrote, "I need your help with something important." The community center buzzed with tension as Mason entered, clutching a folder of hastily printed photographs and documents. The room was more crowded than he'd expected, with familiar and unfamiliar faces filling the metal folding chairs arranged in neat rows before the town council's elevated table. Mason spotted Nancy near the front, who waved him toward an empty seat she'd saved beside her. "Didn't think you'd actually come," she whispered, as he settled his stiff joints into the uncomfortable chair. "Neither did I," Mason admitted, surveying the room. James Davidson sat confidently in the front row, surrounded by men and women in business attire. His development team, presumably. Ranger Steve stood at the back, uniform crisp, nodding acknowledgement when he caught Mason's eye. Mayor Helen Wilkins, a former high school principal whose no-nonsense demeanor had carried over into her political career, called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. After dispensing with procedural matters, she introduced the main agenda item, Proposed Development Plan for Pine Ridge Estates by Davidson Development, Inc. Davidson approached the podium with practiced ease, his presentation slick and persuasive. Digital renderings showed tasteful log cabins nestled among trees, with minimal visual impact on the landscape. He emphasized job creation, tax revenue, and tourism dollars, punctuating each point with professional graphics displaying impressive numbers. Pine Ridge Estates represents a harmonious balance between economic opportunity and environmental stewardship, Davidson concluded, his smile encompassing the entire room. We're not just building vacation homes, we're creating a community that celebrates the natural beauty of this region while ensuring its economic future. The applause that followed wasn't universal, but was substantial enough to make Mason's stomach tighten. He'd forgotten how effectively money could talk, especially in a region where good jobs were scarce and property taxes kept rising. Mayor Wilkins thanked Davidson and opened the floor for public comment. Several local business owners spoke in favor of the development, citing increased customer traffic and supply contracts. The owner of the hardware store mentioned that Davidson had already placed a substantial order for preliminary materials. When Nancy nudged him, Mason realized it was time. With a deep breath that did little to steady his nerves, he approached the podium, setting his folder on the small shelf before him. Looking out at the expectant faces, he was suddenly reminded of his first photography exhibition, the same dry mouth and racing heart. "My name is Mason Miller," he began, his voice rougher than intended. "My wife Emily and I moved here 12 years ago because of the forest. Not despite it, because of it." He opened his folder, removing a large photograph of the wetland area marked for the development's main lodge. "This isn't just pretty scenery. It's a working ecosystem. The wetland here filters water that feeds Crooked Creek, where half this town gets its drinking supply." Mason placed another photograph beside it, a black bear with cubs crossing what would become the development's main access road. "This family crosses here every spring and fall, moving between denning sites and feeding grounds. The proposed road cuts directly through their established path." One by one, he laid out photographs documenting the wildlife that would be displaced: nesting birds, deer, foxes, and finally, a series showing Guardian, Bandit, and the kits in their enclosure. "For the past 5 months, I've been rehabilitating this raccoon family under state wildlife permits. They're scheduled for release next month back into their natural habitat, the same habitat this development plans to bulldoze." Davidson leaned toward his legal counsel, whispering something that made the attorney nod and make a note. Mason recognized the gesture. They were identifying potential legal obstacles, weaknesses in his argument. "Mr. Miller," Mayor Wilkins interjected, "while your wildlife concerns are noted, Davidson Development has completed all required environmental impact assessments. Their plan includes wildlife corridors and conservation areas." Mason nodded, having anticipated this response. "I've reviewed those assessments, Mayor. They were conducted in February, when many species are dormant or less visible. A comprehensive study would require year-round observation." He turned to his final exhibit, a large map of the area with overlaid wildlife movement patterns documented through his camera traps over the past 3 months. Red lines crisscrossed the proposed development area, each representing established animal pathways. "The proposed wildlife corridors don't align with actual wildlife movement," Mason explained, pointing to specific discrepancies. "They're designed for convenience, not effectiveness." A murmur rippled through the audience. Mason noticed several council members leaning forward, studying the map with increased interest. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Miller?" Mayor Wilkins asked, her tone suggesting she expected nothing more than emotional opposition. "A reassessment," Mason replied firmly. conducted by independent wildlife biologists over multiple seasons, and a revised development plan that preserves the wetland entirely and aligns actual wildlife corridors with protected areas. Davidson rose smoothly. If I may, Mayor Wilkins, while Mr. Miller's concerns are certainly heartfelt, our project timeline doesn't allow for additional year-long studies. We've met all legal requirements and are prepared to begin construction next month. Before the mayor could respond, the community center's door opened, admitting a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit, followed by a camera crew and several people carrying equipment cases. Mason recognized his son Thomas immediately, but was puzzled by the entourage and his son's unexpected appearance. Mayor Wilkins frowned. "I'm sorry, this is a public meeting, but filming requires prior authorization." "My apologies for the interruption, Mayor," Thomas said, approaching the council table with professional confidence. "I'm Thomas Miller, representing the National Geographic Society and Wildlife Conservation Trust. We're here regarding the Pine Ridge Development Area." A ripple of excited whispers spread through the room. National Geographic carried weight even here, in this small mountain community. Thomas nodded to Mason before continuing. "When my father contacted me about the wildlife documentation he's been conducting, our research team recognized the significance immediately. The Raccoon Rehabilitation Project alone represents groundbreaking behavioral observation, but his broader wildlife corridor documentation is equally valuable." One of Thomas's companions stepped forward, introducing herself as Dr. Eleanor Chen, Wildlife Conservation Trust's Regional Director. "We've reviewed Mr. Miller's data and find it compelling enough to propose an alternative approach." For the next 15 minutes, Dr. Chen outlined a proposition that left the room in stunned silence. A conservation easement that would preserve the most critical wildlife areas while still allowing limited development in less sensitive zones. The Wildlife Conservation Trust would purchase development rights for the protected portions, while National Geographic would fund a multi-year research project based on Mason's initial work. "This represents a unique opportunity," Dr. Chen concluded, "to create a model of balanced development that could be replicated nationwide. Davidson Development could be at the forefront of truly sustainable luxury wilderness experiences, rather than simply another company claiming environmental consciousness while practicing conventional development." Davidson's expression had shifted from irritation to calculated interest as Dr. Chen spoke. Mason recognized the look. The developer was reassessing potential profits against this new proposal. "While this is certainly an unexpected development," Mayor Wilkins said, regaining her composure, "it would require significant revision to the proposal before us tonight." "We request a 30-day postponement of approval," Thomas responded smoothly, "allowing all parties to explore this alternative approach." After a brief consultation with the council members, Mayor Wilkins agreed to the postponement. The meeting concluded with Davidson and Dr. Chen already exchanging business cards, their conversation animated. Mason remained seated as the room emptied, still processing what had just occurred. Thomas approached, loosening his tie with a smile that reminded Mason powerfully of Emily. "Your email was persuasive," Thomas said, settling into the chair beside his father. "And your timing was impeccable. National Geographic was already interested in your Raccoon project, but combining it with conservation advocacy amplified their enthusiasm tenfold." Mason studied his son's face, seeing beyond the corporate polish to the boy who had once followed him on photography expeditions, carrying extra film canisters and asking endless questions about wildlife behavior. "Didn't expect you to show up in person," Mason said finally. "Thought you'd just make some calls." Thomas's smile faded slightly. "Dad, when you actually asked for my help with something that mattered to you, how could I not come?" The simple statement hung between them, highlighting years of stubborn independence on Mason's part and perhaps equal stubbornness on Thomas's. Mason thought of Emily again, how she had always served as the bridge between their similar but clashing personalities. "Thank you," Mason said simply, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. Back at the cabin, Mason found himself unable to sleep despite the emotional exhaustion of the evening. He sat on the back porch well past midnight, watching the Raccoon family in their outdoor enclosure. The kits were nearly adult-sized now, their playful antics evolving into more purposeful exploration and practice of survival skills. Bandit supervised with decreasing intervention, allowing them to make small mistakes and learn from the consequences. Guardian had visited earlier in the evening, bringing a freshly caught crayfish that he'd displayed prominently at the enclosure edge before consuming it himself, a demonstration of hunting technique that the kits had watched with rapt attention. "Quite the day we've had," Mason told Bandit, who glanced his way briefly before returning her attention to Peanut's attempt to wash a grape in the water dish. "Your family might have saved this whole forest." The irony wasn't lost on Mason, that his impulsive rescue of one injured raccoon had potentially preserved habitat for countless other creatures. Emily would have appreciated the poetry of it, the way small actions could ripple outward with unforeseen consequences. The following days brought a flurry of activity. Dr. Chen and her team established a temporary research station near the wetland area, documenting wildlife activity with sophisticated tracking equipment that made Mason's camera traps look primitive by comparison. Thomas returned to Charlotte but called daily with updates on negotiations between National Geographic, the Wildlife Conservation Trust, and Davidson Development. "He's actually coming around to the idea," Thomas reported one evening. "Davidson, I mean. The publicity value of partnering with National Geographic is significant, and the tax benefits of the conservation easement offset much of the lost development potential." Mason listened from the sewing room, where he was supervising the Raccoon family's latest training session. Following Dr. Carlson's protocol, he had begun introducing elements that would prepare them for release. Varied food sources, hidden in increasingly challenging locations, simulated weather conditions, and recordings of potential predator sounds to instill appropriate caution. "Good," Mason replied, watching Scout successfully extract a worm from inside a hollow log. "Any word on when they'll finish the new environmental assessment?" "Dr. Chen thinks 2 more weeks of data collection should be sufficient for the preliminary report. Enough to justify the conservation easement boundaries, at least." 2 weeks. Mason glanced at the calendar he'd pinned beside the Raccoon enclosure, where he tracked their development and training progress. According to Dr. Carlson's timeline, the family should be ready for release in approximately 3 weeks, late October, giving them time to establish a territory and winter den before the first frost. The timing was tight but workable. If the conservation easement was secured, Mason could release the Raccoon family into protected habitat directly behind his property, where Guardian had already established his territory and where Mason could continue to monitor their progress from a respectful distance. "How's the Raccoon family doing?" Thomas asked, his interest in the project having grown since his involvement began. "Still on track for release this month?" "More or less," Mason hedged, unwilling to acknowledge the conflicted feelings that arose whenever he contemplated the approaching release date. "They're mastering the skills they'll need. Bandit's a good teacher, and Guardian's visits help reinforce wild behaviors." "And how are you doing with the idea of letting them go?" The question, asked gently but directly, caught Mason off guard. He watched Emily the kit successfully navigate an obstacle course he'd constructed from branches and logs, her movements showing the growing confidence of a young raccoon preparing for independence. "It's the goal of rehabilitation," he answered finally. "Always has been." Thomas didn't press the point, but his silence conveyed understanding of the unspoken complexity After they ended the call, Mason remained seated beside the enclosure, observing the family's evening activities with the practiced eye of a wildlife photographer and the conflicted heart of someone preparing to say goodbye. Dr. Carlson's final pre-release visit was scheduled for the following day, a comprehensive assessment of the raccoon family's readiness for return to the wild. Mason had prepared meticulously, compiling detailed records of their progress, video documentation of their mastery of essential skills, and a proposed release plan that aligned with best practices for raccoon rehabilitation. What he couldn't document or quantify was his own readiness for their departure. In the months since finding Bandit trapped and injured, the raccoon family had transformed from a wildlife rehabilitation project into something far more personal. They had become his connection to life beyond grief, a purpose that drew him out of isolation and back into engagement with both the natural world and human community. The irony wasn't lost on Mason, that in preparing these wild creatures to return to their natural habitat, he had inadvertently prepared himself to return to the world of the living. Emily would have pointed this out with her gentle wisdom, probably citing one of the philosophical books she'd loved to read on rainy afternoons. A soft chittering drew Mason's attention back to the enclosure, where Bandit was watching him with that uncanny focus she sometimes displayed. As their eyes met, Mason felt a moment of connection that transcended the boundaries between human and wild creature, a recognition perhaps of the journey they had shared and the separation that approached. "Almost time," he told her softly. "You've done well with your little ones. They're ready, thanks to you." Bandit tilted her head slightly, whiskers twitching before turning back to supervise Rascal's attempts to crack open a walnut, using techniques Guardian had demonstrated during his last visit. Mason rose stiffly, his joints protesting the evening chill that had settled onto the porch. Inside, he found Thomas had sent an email with the latest draft of the conservation easement proposal, including detailed maps of the protected areas. The revised plan preserved the wetland entirely and established a wildlife corridor that aligned precisely with Mason's documented animal movement patterns. It was a victory, more than he had dared hope for when he'd first confronted the development threat. Yet as he studied the maps, Mason's satisfaction was tempered by awareness of the approaching conclusion to the raccoon rehabilitation project. Success meant saying goodbye. Dr. Carlson arrived promptly at 9 the next morning, her clinical demeanor softened slightly by months of working with Mason. She had come to respect his meticulous documentation and careful adherence to protocol, even as she maintained professional boundaries around the rehabilitation process. "They've made excellent progress," she acknowledged after observing the raccoon family's behavior through a series of assessment exercises. Appropriate foraging skills, predator awareness, proper social interactions. Bandit has been an exemplary mother. Mason nodded, pride mingling with the persistent ache of anticipated loss. Guardian's influence has been significant too. His demonstrations of wild behavior reinforced their training. Dr. Carlson made notes on her tablet before looking up with an expression Mason couldn't quite interpret. "The male's continued presence is unusual but beneficial. Have you considered the possibility that he might remain associated with the family post-release?" "Thought about it," Mason admitted. "Can't predict wild behavior with certainty, but he's shown remarkable persistence. It would provide an additional layer of security during their transition." Dr. Carlson completed her assessment form with a few final taps. "Based on my observations, I'm approving release for next week, October 22nd, weather permitting. That gives them adequate time to establish a winter territory while food sources remain accessible." October 22nd. Mason had known the date was approaching, had prepared for it methodically, but hearing it confirmed sent a jolt of reality through him. 7 days remaining with the raccoon family that had become the center of his world. "The conservation easement should be finalized by then," he said, focusing on practical matters to mask his emotional response. They'll be released directly into protected habitat. Dr. Carlson nodded approvingly. Ideal circumstances. You've done exemplary work with this rehabilitation, Mr. Miller. The documentation alone will be valuable to future projects. After she departed, Mason found himself drawn back to the raccoon enclosure, where the family was engaged in their mid-morning activities, Bandit supervising as the kits practiced climbing techniques on the branches he'd arranged in varying configurations. They moved with growing confidence and skill, their bodies developing the muscle memory that would serve them in the wild. Mason retrieved his camera almost without conscious thought, framing and capturing their movements with the practiced eye of a professional photographer. These would be among the final images of the rehabilitation project, documentation not just for scientific records but for his own memory, preserving what would soon exist only in the past. The week passed with uncomfortable speed. Mason alternated between practical preparation for the release and emotional preparation for the absence that would follow. He constructed a soft release enclosure at the edge of the forest behind his cabin, a temporary structure that would allow the raccoon family to acclimate to their new environment while still providing shelter and supplementary food during the transition. Thomas arrived 2 days before the scheduled release, his presence both a support and a complication. Mason appreciated his son's genuine interest in the project and his instrumental role in securing the conservation easement, but found himself uncharacteristically protective of his final days with the raccoon family. National Geographic wants to document the release, Thomas mentioned over dinner the night before the scheduled date. Just a small crew, very unobtrusive. It would be valuable footage for the feature. Mason pushed his barely touched stew around his plate. Don't want a circus. These animals have had limited human contact for a reason. I understand that, Dad, but this is an opportunity to share what you've accomplished. The rehabilitation success, the conservation victory. It aligns perfectly with the story National Geographic wants to tell. Mason knew his son was right from a practical standpoint. The media coverage would reinforce the conservation easement's importance and potentially inspire similar projects elsewhere. Yet something in him resisted sharing this final, pivotal moment with strangers and cameras. I'll think about it, he said finally, rising to clear his plate though he'd eaten little. That night, Mason sat alone on the back porch long after Thomas had retired to the guest room. The raccoon family was unusually quiet in their enclosure, as if they somehow sensed the approaching transition. Rusty lay at Mason's feet, his aging body warm against the autumn chill. "What would you advise, Em?" Mason asked softly, addressing the star-filled sky above. Public good versus private sentiment. You were always better at balancing those. No answer came from the silent cosmos, but as Mason watched, a shooting star traced a brief, brilliant path overhead. Emily would have called it a sign, would have insisted the universe was offering guidance, if only he'd interpret it correctly. Mason smiled faintly at the thought. Subtle as ever, he murmured. The decision crystallized gradually as he sat watching the raccoon family's nighttime movements. This release, this culmination of months of work and care, belonged not just to him but to a larger purpose. If documenting it could help protect other wildlife and inspire conservation efforts, then his personal reluctance was a small price to pay. When he finally rose to return inside, his decision was made. The release would be documented, but on his terms, respecting the animal's welfare above all else. Release day dawned clear and cool, perfect conditions for the raccoon family's transition to independence. The National Geographic crew, just 2 photographers and a field producer as Thomas had promised, arrived early, setting up equipment at a respectful distance from the soft release enclosure. Dr. Carlson came to oversee the process officially, accompanied by Ranger Steve, whose support throughout the project had evolved from reluctant oversight to genuine enthusiasm. Nancy brought coffee and homemade muffins for everyone, her practical contribution to what she recognized as an emotionally challenging day for Mason. The transportation of the Raccoon family from their cabin enclosure to the soft release structure proceeded smoothly, following the protocol Mason had rehearsed repeatedly in his mind. Each raccoon was carefully placed in an individual carrier, first the kits, then Bandit, and moved with minimal stress to their new temporary home at the forest edge. Mason had constructed the soft release enclosure with meticulous attention to detail, large enough to allow comfortable movement, equipped with familiar nesting boxes and climbing structures, partially covered to provide shelter from elements, and strategically positioned adjacent to proven raccoon habitat. The door was designed to remain open once unlocked, allowing the family to leave when they felt ready, rather than being forced out. As Mason prepared to open the carrier doors inside the new enclosure, he became acutely aware of the cameras recording this moment, of the observers watching with professional and personal interest. He took a deep breath, centering himself in the task at hand rather than the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. One by one, he opened the carriers. The kits emerged cautiously, investigating their new surroundings with the curiosity that had characterized their development. Bandit exited last, immediately checking on each kit before conducting her own assessment of the enclosure. Mason backed away slowly, closing the enclosure door but leaving it unlocked. The final step in the soft release protocol. Now the raccoon family would have time to acclimate, with supplementary food provided until they demonstrated self-sufficiency in foraging. "Perfect execution," Dr. Carlson commented quietly as Mason rejoined the observers. "They're showing appropriate exploratory behavior without excessive stress." Mason nodded, unable to trust his voice. He had done everything by the book, had prepared both the raccoons and himself for this moment, yet the reality of it constricted his chest with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride and loss inextricably intertwined. As the group watched from a distance, a rustling in the underbrush drew their attention. Guardian emerged from the forest edge, approaching the soft release enclosure with cautious interest. The cameras swiveled to capture this unexpected development as the male raccoon investigated the structure, chittering softly when he detected the family inside. "Remarkable," Dr. Carlson murmured. "He's tracked them to the new location." Bandit responded to Guardian's calls, approaching the mesh barrier that separated them. The kits followed, their excitement evident in increased activity and vocalizations. It was a reunion Mason had hoped for but hadn't dared expect so quickly. Evidence that the wild male remained connected to this family despite their months in rehabilitation. "This is why your documentation has been so valuable," Ranger Steve told Mason. "This kind of extended family bond in raccoons challenges what we thought we knew about their social structure." Mason watched the interaction through the viewfinder of his own camera, the familiar action of photography providing emotional distance from the moment. Through the lens, he could focus on the technical aspects, composition, lighting, behavior capture, rather than the personal significance of this transition. The National Geographic crew captured it all. The raccoon family exploring their new enclosure, Guardian's appearance and interaction through the mesh, Mason's quiet observation and documentation. It was, the field producer whispered to Thomas, absolutely perfect material for their feature on citizen science and conservation. As the afternoon progressed, the observers gradually departed. First, Dr. Carlson with formal congratulations on a successful rehabilitation, then the National Geographic crew with profuse thanks and promises of follow-up, finally Nancy with a squeeze of Mason's arm and an invitation to dinner. "Whenever you're ready." Only Thomas, Ranger Steve, and Mason remained as sunset approached, watching the raccoon family settle into their temporary new home. Guardian had established a position near the enclosure, apparently intending to remain close through the night. "You did it, Dad," Thomas said quietly. Everything by the book, and then some. Mason nodded, his gaze fixed on Bandit as she arranged her kits in their new nesting box. They did most of the work. I just provided the opportunity. Don't sell yourself short, Steve countered. Most rehabilitated wildlife has a 60 to 70% survival rate after release. With your preparation and guardian's presence, this family has exceptional prospects. The validation should have provided comfort, but Mason found himself struggling with unexpected emotions as the reality of completion settled over him. For months, his days had been structured around the Raccoon family's needs and development. Tomorrow would dawn without that purpose, without their presence in Emily's sewing room, without the quiet chittering that had become the soundtrack of his healing. "You okay to be alone tonight, Dad?" Thomas asked, perceptive enough to recognize the complex emotions his father was experiencing. "I can stay an extra day if you want company." Mason shook his head. "Need some time to adjust. But thanks for offering, son." After Thomas and Steve departed, Mason remained at the observation point he'd established near the soft release enclosure. As darkness fell, he watched the Raccoon family's movements slow, Bandit gathering her kits into the familiar sleeping configuration they'd maintained throughout their time in rehabilitation. Guardian remained nearby, occasionally visible when he moved positions, a shadow among shadows in the forest edge. "You'll look after them," Mason said quietly, the words meant for Guardian, though the Raccoon couldn't possibly understand. "That's something, at least." The stars emerged overhead, the same constellations Emily had taught him to recognize during their early dating years. Mason found the familiar patterns, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper, Orion rising in the east, and felt a moment of connection across time and loss. "They'll be all right, Em," he whispered to the star-filled sky, "and I guess I will be too." The first night without the Raccoon family felt interminable. Mason wandered his cabin restlessly, pausing in the doorway of Emily's sewing room, now emptied of the enclosure, cameras, and monitoring equipment that had filled it for months. The space seemed cavernous in its emptiness, echoing with absence. Emily's quilt, the one Bandit had chosen for her birthing nest, had been carefully cleaned and returned to the cedar chest, though Mason fancied it still carried the faint impression of the Raccoon family that had made it their first home. Sleep eluded him. Every few hours he walked to the back porch, peering into the darkness toward the soft release enclosure barely visible at the forest's edge. The beam of his flashlight revealed nothing but the metal structure gleaming dully among the trees. Had the raccoons remained inside, accepting the security of the familiar enclosure? Or had they already ventured into the wild, embracing the freedom he'd prepared them for? Morning brought fog rolling through the valley, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal and strange. Mason made coffee by rote, his movements mechanical. Rusty seemed to share his melancholy, the old dog wandering between the back door and the empty sewing room, sniffing the spaces where the Raccoon family had lived. "They're where they belong now, boy," Mason told him, though the words provided little comfort to either of them. After a breakfast he barely tasted, Mason bundled up against the autumn chill and made his way to the soft release enclosure, Rusty trailing behind. He approached cautiously, mindful of disturbing the raccoons if they remained inside. The site appeared undisturbed, the door still open as he'd left it. But as he drew closer, Mason realized the enclosure was empty. No masked faces peered out, no chittering greeted his arrival. They had gone, slipping away into the forest under cover of night or early morning fog. Mason stood motionless, experiencing an odd disconnection. Intellectual satisfaction at this evidence of their readiness, competing with emotional hollowness at their absence. The supplementary food he'd left remained untouched, A good sign, Dr. Carlson would say, evidence that the family was finding natural food sources rather than depending on human provision. Mason replenished it anyway, placing fresh berries, nuts, and eggs in the feeding station. He would continue this protocol for 2 weeks, gradually reducing the offerings until they were no longer needed. "Good luck out there," he said softly to the empty enclosure, his voice quickly absorbed by the morning mist. Back at the cabin, the answering machine blinked with messages. Nancy checking in, Thomas confirming his safe return to Charlotte, Dr. Carlson requesting a report on the release outcome. Mason ignored them all, retreating instead to his office where months of Raccoon documentation awaited organization. The National Geographic feature would require select photographs and video clips. The scientific paper he'd begun drafting for the Wildlife Journal needed completion. Work had always been his refuge, his way of processing emotion through focused productivity. Emily had understood this about him, had given him space after difficult assignments or personal setbacks, knowing he would emerge when ready. The habit reasserted itself now as Mason immersed himself in editing footage, selecting images, refining his written observations until the light faded and his eyes burned with fatigue. 3 days passed in similar fashion. Mason maintained the schedule he'd established. Morning checks of the soft release enclosure, always empty, though the food consistently disappeared overnight. Daytime work on his documentation, evening vigils on the back porch, hoping for glimpses of his former charges. He replied to messages with brief reassurances that all was well, deflecting Nancy's dinner invitations and Thomas's concerned inquiries with promises of soon and when things settle. On the 4th morning, Mason found evidence of visitors at the soft release site, distinctive paw prints in the mud surrounding the enclosure, both adult-sized and smaller. The Raccoon family had returned during the night, perhaps drawn by the supplementary food or the familiar security of the structure. Mason photographed the tracks meticulously, noting their direction, leading deeper into the protected forest area rather than toward his cabin. A bittersweet victory. They were establishing independence while maintaining connection to the release site, exactly as the protocol recommended. Mason should have felt only professional satisfaction, but the clear boundary the Raccoon family had drawn, returning to the enclosure but not to him, struck a chord of personal loss he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. And that afternoon, Thomas called again. "Dad, Nancy says you're not answering your door or accepting her invitations." "Been busy," Mason replied, shifting papers on his desk to create background noise suggesting productivity. Lot of material to organize for National Geographic. Thomas's silence conveyed skepticism. "The raccoons are gone, aren't they?" The direct question caught Mason off guard. "Of course they're gone. That was the whole point." "I know it was, but that doesn't mean you can't feel it as a loss." Mason stared out his office window at the forest edge, remembering Emily's frequent observation that their son had inherited her emotional intelligence rather than Mason's stoic pragmatism. They're doing exactly what they should be doing. Establishing territory, avoiding human contact. "And what are you doing, Dad?" The question hung in the air, its simplicity belying its weight. What was he doing? Existing in a holding pattern, moving mechanically through days suddenly devoid of the purpose that had sustained him through months of grief. "Working," he answered finally. "Documenting. What I've always done." Thomas sighed, the sound carrying clearly through the phone line. "Mom would want more for you than just existing, Dad, you know that." After ending the call with non-committal promises to think about it, Mason found himself standing in the doorway of the sewing room again. The space remained as empty as it had been 4 days ago, yet somehow the quality of the emptiness had shifted. It was no longer just absence. The absence of Emily, the absence of the Raccoon family, but possibility, a space waiting to be redefined. Mason crossed to the cedar chest, running his hand over its smooth surface. He lifted the lid, revealing the neatly folded quilts Emily had completed in her final years. The blue and white ocean waves pattern that Bandit had chosen lay on top, now clean but forever connected to new life in Mason's mind. Beneath it lay projects in various stages of completion: a wedding quilt for their niece, a baby blanket for a colleague's grandchild, a complex pattern Emily had designed herself but never finished. Her sewing basket sat beside the chest, threads and needles arranged with characteristic precision. Mason lifted the wedding quilt, unfurling it across the empty space where the raccoon enclosure had stood. The pattern emerged, interlocking rings in shades of burgundy and gold, nearly complete except for the border Emily had been working on when her diagnosis interrupted her plans. He hadn't touched her sewing things since her death. Hadn't known how. But now, standing in this room transformed first by loss and then by unexpected new life, Mason felt a different kind of possibility. Not replacement of what was lost, but continuation. Evolution. Emily had taught him basic quilting techniques during their early marriage, insisting it would improve his manual dexterity for camera work. He'd learned reluctantly but effectively, his photographer's eye appreciating the geometric precision and color harmony even as his fingers fumbled with unfamiliar tools. Mason retrieved Emily's sewing basket, settling into her chair with the unfinished quilt spread before him. It took several minutes to remember how to thread the needle, to recall the particular stitch Emily had been using for the border. His first attempts were clumsy, the stitches uneven. But gradually the muscle memory returned, the rhythm of needle through fabric, the gentle tension of thread, the satisfaction of completing each small section. Hours passed unnoticed as Mason worked, his focus absolute. When he finally looked up, darkness had fallen outside the windows and his back ached from the unaccustomed posture. But a foot of border had been completed, the stitches becoming more even as he progressed. Not Emily's perfect technique, but recognizably derived from it, a continuation. That night, Mason slept soundly for the first time since the raccoon's release. He dreamed of Emily sitting beside him at her sewing table, guiding his hands as they worked together on the quilt. "You're learning," she told him in the dream, her smile as vibrant as it had been before illness dulled it. "You always do, eventually." He woke with renewed purpose, not the urgent purpose of wildlife rehabilitation, but something quieter and equally meaningful. The quilt would be completed. Emily's work would continue through his hands. It wasn't a replacement for what he'd lost, but an honoring of it, an integration of past and present. The morning check of the soft release enclosure revealed more tracks. The Raccoon family had visited again overnight, taking the supplementary food and leaving clear evidence of their continuing survival. Mason photographed the tracks methodically, noting subtle differences that might distinguish individual family members. Guardian's larger prints were clearly identifiable, confirming the male's continued association with the family group. Back at the cabin, Mason finally returned Nancy's calls, accepting her dinner invitation for the following evening. He spent the day alternating between organizing his raccoon documentation and working on the quilt border, finding unexpected parallels between the two activities, both requiring attention to detail, patience, and respect for established patterns while allowing for personal interpretation. That evening, as twilight settled over the forest, Mason sat on his back porch with Rusty at his feet, a cup of coffee warming his hands against the autumn chill. The fog that had lingered for days had finally cleared, revealing a sky painted in dramatic oranges and purples as the sun descended behind the mountains. Movement at the forest edge caught his attention. a flash of distinctive masked face appearing briefly before vanishing again into the underbrush. Mason remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Moments later, a raccoon emerged fully from the trees, not approaching the cabin but visible enough for clear identification. Bandit. Her coat glossy in health, her movements confident as she paused to scan the clearing between forest and cabin. Behind her, smaller shapes appeared, the kits, now nearly adult-sized but still recognizable in their movements and markings. They remained at the forest edge, not venturing into the open space, but clearly visible to Mason's practiced eye. Guardian appeared last, his larger form materializing from the shadows to stand beside Bandit. The male raccoon seemed to look directly at the porch where Mason sat motionless, their gazes connecting briefly across the distance before Guardian chittered softly to his adopted family. As one unit, they melted back into the forest, leaving Mason with the distinct impression that he had been visited rather than simply observed. The encounter lasted less than a minute, but its impact lingered long after the raccoons disappeared. They had chosen to show themselves, to acknowledge the connection that remained despite their return to the wild. It wasn't anthropomorphism to recognize this, Mason decided. It was simply observation of behavior, the foundation of all his wildlife work. The next morning, Mason contacted Thomas with a decision he'd been considering since the release. "I'd like to do the National Geographic interview," he said when his son answered. "The full feature, not just providing footage and photographs." Thomas's surprise was evident. "That's great, Dad. They'll be thrilled. But what changed your mind? You were pretty reluctant before." Mason considered how to explain the subtle but profound shift in his perspective. "The story's bigger than just my experience," he said finally. "It's about connection between humans and wildlife, between conservation and community. Emily would want that story told." The interview was scheduled for the following week, giving Mason time to complete his organization of materials and prepare the main points he wanted to communicate. In the intervening days, he settled into a new routine. Mornings checking the soft release site and walking the forest edge looking for signs of the raccoon family. Afternoons working on documentation or quilting. Evenings on the porch, sometimes glimpsing his former charges at the forest boundary. Nancy's dinner provided unexpected social reinforcement, her practical friendship offering perspective on his months of isolation. "You look better," she told him bluntly as they washed dishes after the meal. "More present." Mason nodded, accepting the assessment without defensiveness. "Had some things to figure out." "And have you figured them out?" He considered the question seriously, thinking of the raccoon family establishing their independence while maintaining connection, of Emily's unfinished quilt taking shape under his unpracticed but determined hands, of Thomas's unexpected support bridging years of distance. "Getting there," he answered honestly. "One stitch at a time." The day before the National Geographic crew was scheduled to arrive, Mason received an unexpected visitor. Ranger Steve's Forest Service vehicle pulled up the gravel drive mid-morning, but it wasn't the ranger who emerged from the passenger side. Dr. Carlson approached the porch where Mason was enjoying his coffee, her expression uncharacteristically concerned. "Mr. Miller," she began without preamble, "we have a situation with your raccoon family." The words sent a jolt of alarm through Mason. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, bracing for bad news. "What kind of situation?" Dr. Carlson sat in the chair Mason indicated, arranging her thoughts before continuing. "A hunter reported seeing a raccoon caught in an illegal trap on the eastern boundary of the conservation easement. Based on the location and description, we believe it may be your rehabilitated female." Mason's chest tightened painfully. "Bandit?" "Is she alive when last reported?" Dr. Carlson interjected quickly. "The hunter didn't have tools to release her safely, so he marked the location and reported it immediately. Ranger Donnelly is organizing a response team now." "I'm going with you," Mason said, already rising to gather necessary equipment. Dr. Carlson didn't argue, apparently having anticipated this reaction. The terrain is difficult, steep and rocky. Are you certain you're up to it physically? The question might have offended Mason months ago, triggering defensiveness about his age and capabilities. Now he simply assessed it pragmatically. I know these woods better than most, and she knows me. Might make the rescue less stressful for her. 20 minutes later, Mason found himself in the back of a Forest Service UTV, bouncing along overgrown fire roads toward the eastern boundary of what was now officially designated as the Miller Wildlife Corridor. Ranger Steve drove, with Dr. Carlson and a wildlife technician named Rodriguez completing the rescue team. Trapping season doesn't open for another month, Steve explained over his shoulder as they navigated the rough terrain. And this area is clearly marked as restricted. Someone deliberately set illegal traps. Davidson's people? Mason suggested. The developer had ultimately agreed to the conservation easement, but not without expressing frustration about the reduced scope of his project. Steve shrugged. Possible, but difficult to prove. Could also be locals who don't respect the new boundaries. We've had some pushback from traditional hunting families who've used these woods for generations. The UTV could only take them so far. The last half-mile required hiking through increasingly steep forest, following the hunter's GPS coordinates. Mason felt every one of his 72 years as they climbed, his breath coming in labored gasps despite the cardiac medication that had stabilized his condition. But concern for Bandit drove him forward, keeping pace with the younger members of the team despite their worried glances. They heard her before they saw her, distressed, chittering echoing through the trees, the unmistakable sound of a raccoon in pain and fear. Mason's pace quickened despite his fatigue, leading the group around a rocky outcropping to a small clearing where the scene unfolded with heart-wrenching clarity. Bandit was indeed caught in a trap, a cruel toothed device clamped around her right front paw. She pulled desperately against its chain, which was secured to a nearby tree. Blood matted her fur where the metal teeth bit into flesh. But it was the presence of her family that made the scene particularly poignant. All 4 kits circled their mother anxiously, while guardians stood guard, chittering warnings at the approaching humans. Jesus, Rodriguez muttered, reaching for the tranquilizer gun slung across his back. Never seen anything like this. Whole family staying with a trapped animal. Mason held up his hand. Wait, let me try first. Dr. Carlson frowned. Protocol for trapped wildlife is clear, Mr. Miller. We tranquilize to prevent further injury during removal. She knows me, Mason insisted, and tranquilizing her will stress the others, maybe drive them away. They need to see her released and recovering. The wildlife veterinarian hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the unique circumstances. Finally, she nodded. You have 1 attempt. If she shows any sign of increased distress or aggression, we tranquilize immediately. Mason approached slowly, speaking in the same calm, low voice he'd used throughout the rehabilitation. Easy, Bandit. We're here to help. Easy now. Guardian's warnings intensified, the male raccoon placing himself between Mason and the trapped female. Rather than attempting to bypass him, Mason stopped, crouching to appear less threatening. Remember me, big fella? Not going to hurt her, promise. Whether Guardian actually recognized Mason was impossible to determine, but after tense moments of standoff, the male raccoon backed away slightly, not abandoning his protective position but allowing Mason to edge closer to Bandit. The female raccoon's eyes were wide with pain and fear. But as Mason continued speaking softly, her frantic struggling subsided somewhat. He moved with exaggerated slowness, allowing her to track his movements as he reached into his pocket for work gloves and the multi-tool he always carried. Going to get you out of this, girl. Just hold still a bit longer." The trap was a vicious design, its jaws designed to clamp tighter with struggling. Mason examined the mechanism carefully, identifying the release points while Rodriguez quietly explained the procedure from a safe distance. Disarming such devices required simultaneous pressure on both springs, a two-person job under normal circumstances. "Need another set of hands," Mason admitted after his first attempt failed to create enough leverage. To everyone's surprise, Guardian approached cautiously, chittering softly to Bandit, who responded with quieter sounds of her own. The male raccoon positioned himself beside the injured female, his body pressing against hers in what appeared to be deliberate comfort or support. "I'll be damned," Steve murmured. "He's calming her." With Bandit slightly more settled, Mason made another attempt at the trap springs, straining against their tension. Rodriguez edged closer, ready to assist, but before he could reach Mason, another figure darted from the underbrush, Scout, the most adventurous of the kits, now nearly adult-sized. The young raccoon positioned himself on Bandit's other side, mimicking Guardian's supportive posture. This coordinated behavior from 3 wild raccoons left the rescue team in stunned silence, witnessing something few wildlife professionals had ever observed. "Try again, Mr. Miller," Dr. Carlson said softly. "They're working with you." With renewed determination, Mason applied pressure to both springs simultaneously. The trap's jaws loosened fractionally, enough for Bandit to withdraw her injured paw with a cry of pain that tore at Mason's heart. She collapsed immediately, cradling the damaged limb against her body, while Guardian and Scout pressed close on either side. Dr. Carlson moved forward cautiously, medical kit in hand. "We need to treat that wound before infection sets in, but I don't want to separate her from her family." Mason nodded, understanding both the medical necessity and the importance of maintaining the family bond. "What if we treat her here? Minimal handling, just enough to clean and bandage the wound." The wildlife veterinarian considered this unorthodox approach. Highly irregular, but under the circumstances perhaps the best option. "I'll need your help keeping her calm." What followed was perhaps the strangest wildlife treatment Dr. Carlson had ever performed, administering first aid to a wild raccoon while her family remained in close attendance and her former rehabilitator provided reassurance. Mason maintained a constant stream of quiet talk, the same voice and phrases he'd used during rehabilitation. Whether Bandit actually remembered and was comforted by this or simply responded to the calm tone was impossible to determine, but she remained relatively still during the brief treatment. "The wound is deep, but clean," Dr. Carlson reported as she applied antibiotic ointment and a light bandage. "No broken bones that I can detect. I'd prefer to administer antibiotics, but that would require capture and transport." Mason studied Bandit's posture, the protective stances of Guardian and the kits, the wild setting that was now their home. "She's survived worse. And she has family support." The decision was made to leave the raccoon family in the wild rather than subjecting Bandit to the additional trauma of capture and confinement. Rodriguez disabled and removed the trap, while Ranger Steve photographed it for evidence in the illegal trapping investigation. Dr. Carlson left additional antibiotic ointment with Mason, who would attempt to provide follow-up treatment if the raccoon family returned to the soft release site. As the rescue team prepared to depart, Mason lingered, watching Bandit being tended by her family in a role reversal of her earlier maternal care. Guardian and the kits surrounded her protectively, occasionally grooming her fur or chittering softly in apparent communication. "We should go, Mr. Miller," Dr. Carlson said gently. "They need time to recover without human presence." Mason nodded, understanding the wisdom of this while reluctant to leave Bandit injured. As he turned to follow the others, a soft chittering drew his attention back. Bandit had raised her head, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that transcended the supposed boundaries between human and wild creature. In that moment of connection, Mason felt something release within himself, a final letting go of responsibility, an acknowledgement that this wild family now belonged fully to themselves and to each other. They had formed bonds that would sustain them through this setback and whatever challenges followed. "Goodbye, Bandit," he said softly. "Take care of each other." The hike back to the UTV was arduous, Mason's earlier adrenaline fading to leave him acutely aware of his physical limitations. By the time they reached the vehicle, his heart pounded uncomfortably and his breath came in labored gasps. "You need to rest," Dr. Carlson said firmly, noting his pallor. "That was too strenuous for someone with your cardiac history." Mason didn't argue, allowing Steve to help him into the UTV while Rodriguez secured their equipment. The return journey passed in relative silence, each member of the team processing what they had witnessed, behavior that challenged conventional understanding of raccoon social structures and human-wildlife interaction. At the cabin, Dr. Carlson insisted on checking Mason's vital signs before departing. "Your pulse is elevated but normalizing," she reported, removing the blood pressure cuff from his arm. "Take your medication and rest for the remainder of the day. No hiking or strenuous activity." Mason agreed readily, his body's exhaustion overriding any inclination to resist medical advice. After the Forest Service team departed, he settled into his recliner with Rusty at his feet, reflecting on the day's events. Concern for Bandit's injury competed with amazement at the Raccoon family's coordinated behavior and their apparent willingness to accept his help despite weeks in the wild. He must have dozed off because the ringing phone startled him awake. Thomas's voice came through the line, immediately concerned. "Dad, are you okay? Ranger Steve called and told me what happened." Mason straightened in his chair, surprised by the communication network that had apparently formed around him without his awareness. "I'm fine. Tired. Bandit's the one who's injured. He mentioned that too. Said you were pretty incredible out there, keeping the raccoons calm, helping with the trap removal." A dismissive response rose automatically to Mason's lips, the habitual deflection of praise that had characterized much of his life. But something stopped him. Perhaps the genuine admiration in his son's voice, or the day's reminder of life's fragility and the importance of acknowledging connection. "We worked together," he said instead. "The raccoons and me. One last time." That evening, Mason sat on his back porch, despite the autumn chill, watching the forest edge for any sign of the raccoon family's return. Logic suggested they would remain in deeper woods while Bandit recovered, away from potential human threats. But hope kept him vigilant as darkness descended, transforming the familiar landscape into shadowy mystery. No masked faces appeared at the forest boundary. No distinctive chittering broke the night's silence. The raccoon family remained where they belonged, in the wild, caring for their injured member, continuing their lives beyond his direct observation. As Mason finally rose to return inside, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him. Not the absence of grief or concern, but their integration into a larger perspective that encompassed both loss and continuation, separation and connection. The raccoon family would survive with or without his witnessing. His role in their story had reached its natural conclusion. Tomorrow, the National Geographic crew would arrive to document what remained, the photographs, the conservation victory, his transition from wildlife photographer to rehabilitator to advocate. He would share what he had learned about raccoon social behavior, about the unexpected intelligence and family bonds he had witnessed. But the most profound lessons, about finding purpose after loss, about letting go while maintaining connection, those belong to a more personal narrative, one Emily would have understood instinctively. Inside the cabin, Mason paused in the doorway of the sewing room, where Emily's unfinished quilt now lay partially completed on the table, his uneven stitches continuing the pattern she had begun. Tomorrow, after the interview, he would work on it again, one more section of border, one more connection between past and future. "You were right, Em," he said softly to the empty room that somehow still held her presence. "It's not about holding on. It's about finding the thread that connects it all, even when the pattern changes." The National Geographic team arrived precisely at 10 the next morning, their van crunching up Mason's gravel driveway with professional efficiency. Mason watched from his porch as they unloaded equipment, cameras, lighting, sound gear, with the practiced coordination of people accustomed to working together in varied environments. Thomas had assured him they would be unobtrusive, respectful of both his space and the wildlife story they had come to document. Still, Mason felt a flutter of apprehension as he rose to greet them. The producer, a woman named Elaine Winters with salt and pepper hair and weathered laugh lines, approached with extended hand. "Mr. Miller, it's an honor to meet you. Your son has told us so much about your work with the Raccoon family." Mason shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "Thomas tends to exaggerate my accomplishments." "I doubt that," Elaine replied with a smile that suggested she'd encountered similar modesty from other subjects. "We've reviewed your footage. It's extraordinary documentation of raccoon behavior rarely observed in the wild." The interview setup transformed Mason's living room into a temporary studio. Lights positioned to create natural-looking illumination, microphones discreetly placed, cameras arranged for different angles. Mason sat somewhat stiffly in his favorite armchair. Rusty settled at his feet as Elaine explained their approach. "We want this to feel like a conversation, not an interrogation," she assured him. "Just share your experience as you would with a friend. We can always pause if you need a moment to collect your thoughts." Despite his initial discomfort, Mason found himself relaxing as the interview progressed. Elaine's questions were thoughtful, informed by careful research into both raccoon behavior and Mason's photography career. She guided him through the narrative chronologically, finding Bandit injured, the decision to rehabilitate her, the birth of the kits, Guardian's unexpected involvement, the release, and yesterday's trap incident. "What surprised you most about the Raccoon family during rehabilitation?" she asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Mason considered the question, mentally reviewing months of observation. "Their intelligence," he answered finally. "Not just problem-solving skills, though those were impressive. Their emotional intelligence, how they communicated with each other, how they seemed to recognize individual humans and adjust their behavior accordingly." "You're careful to avoid anthropomorphizing in your documentation," Elaine noted. "Yet you clearly formed a connection with these animals. There's a difference between projecting human emotions onto animals and recognizing genuine connection between species," Mason replied, finding himself articulating thoughts he hadn't fully formed until this moment. "Good wildlife photographers understand that. You observe patterns, behaviors, interactions without imposing your interpretation, but you also acknowledge the relationship that forms through observation itself." Elaine nodded encouragingly. "Yesterday's incident seems to support that view. The Raccoon family allowed you to approach and help when they were actively defending against other humans." "They remembered," Mason said simply. "Or at least, Bandit did. She associated my voice, my presence with safety rather than threat." That's not anthropomorphizing, it's recognizing learned association, which many species demonstrate. The conversation shifted to the conservation aspect of the story, how Mason's rehabilitation project had unexpectedly led to protecting significant wildlife habitat through the conservation easement. Would you say your personal connection to this raccoon family made you a more effective advocate for the larger ecosystem? Elaine asked. Mason hadn't considered this perspective, but it resonated with his experience. Probably did, he acknowledged. People respond to specific stories more than abstract concepts. One raccoon mother with 4 kits is more compelling than discussing wildlife habitat in general terms. Your wife was an environmental advocate, I understand? The question caught Mason off guard, though he'd known personal elements would arise during the interview. Emily was the activist between us, he said after a moment. I just took pictures. She understood how to translate images into action. Yet you successfully protected a significant tract of forest from development, Elaine pointed out gently. That suggests you learned something from her approach. Mason glanced at the photograph of Emily on the side table, her smile captured in morning light during their last anniversary trip to Yellowstone. Guess I did, he admitted. Took me long enough. The interview continued through the afternoon, pausing occasionally as Mason's energy flagged, or when the cinematographer wanted to capture B-roll footage of the cabin, the forest edge, the conservation easement boundary. They filmed Mason checking the soft release enclosure, now empty but still maintained with supplementary food for the raccoon family's occasional visits. They recorded him explaining the camera trap setup he'd established to continue monitoring wildlife movement through the protected corridor. As golden hour approached, that magical time near sunset when natural light takes on a warm dimensional quality, photographer's prize, Elaine suggested moving to the back porch for the final segment. There's a question I've been wanting to ask, she said as they settled into the porch chairs, the forest visible beyond Mason's small clearing. What happens next for you? After the raccoon family, after this project is complete? It was the question Mason had been asking himself since the release, more urgently since yesterday's encounter with the injured bandit. What did come next? The rehabilitation had given him purpose during the darkest period of grief. The conservation fight had reconnected him with community. The documentation had reawakened his professional identity, but these were all reaching natural conclusions. Still figuring that out, he answered honestly. Got the quilt to finish first. The quilt? Elaine asked, clearly intrigued by this unexpected turn. Mason described Emily's unfinished projects, how he'd begun completing her wedding quilt, finding unexpected solace in continuing her work through his hands. As he spoke, he realized the quilt had become more than just an activity to fill empty hours. It represented a different kind of continuation, a tangible connection to Emily that didn't require clinging to unchanging grief. Would you be willing to show us? Elaine asked. The quilt, I mean. It seems significant to your story. Mason hesitated, protective of this private aspect of his healing. But there was value in sharing it, he realized, the same value he found in documenting the raccoon family's journey. Some stories deserved witnessing. All right, he agreed, leading them to the sewing room where the partially completed quilt lay spread across Emily's work table. The cinematographer captured Mason's hands as he demonstrated the stitching technique, the contrast between Emily's precise work and his more uneven but improving efforts. The visual metaphor wasn't lost on anyone present, the pattern continuing despite the change in execution, the beauty emerging from collaboration across absence. My wife would say I'm being too literal, Mason commented, as he secured his needle and thread, preparing to continue working later. She always saw the symbolic connections before I did. Elaine smiled. What symbolic connection do you see in this quilt now? Mason ran his hand over the fabric, feeling the texture of Emily's stitches beside his own. That continuing someone's work doesn't mean doing it exactly as they would have. It means honoring their pattern while adding your own thread to it. As the interview concluded and the team packed their equipment, Mason felt a curious lightness. Articulating his experience, both with the Raccoon family and with grief, had clarified something important. The story wasn't ending, it was transforming, evolving into something he couldn't yet fully envision, but could continue moving toward. Elaine thanked him with genuine warmth as they prepared to depart. "We'll send you a rough cut before anything is finalized," she assured him. "Your story. It's going to resonate with a lot of people, Mr. Miller." "Mason," he corrected, surprising himself with the informality. "If you're going to tell my story, might as well use my name." After the van disappeared down his driveway, Mason returned to the back porch with a cup of coffee, settling into his chair to watch the approaching sunset. The forest edge remained quiet, no sign of raccoon visitors, but he felt their presence nonetheless, continuing their wild lives beyond his sight, connected to him through the shared experience that had changed them all. His phone rang as twilight deepened, Thomas's name illuminating the screen. "How'd it go with National Geographic?" his son asked without preamble. "Better than expected," Mason admitted. "Professional group asked good questions. Elaine called me already, said you were compelling and authentic. High praise from her." Mason grunted, uncomfortable with the compliment, but making an effort not to dismiss it entirely. "Just told the truth as I experienced it. That's what makes a good story, Dad." Thomas paused before continuing in a more hesitant tone. "Listen, I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to run it by you before I got too far along." "Go ahead," Mason encouraged, curious about his son's uncharacteristic uncertainty. "The girls are showing interest in wildlife photography, probably from hearing about your work all these years. I thought maybe this summer they could spend a few weeks at the cabin with you. Learn from the master, so to speak." The suggestion caught Mason entirely off guard. His granddaughters had visited occasionally during Emily's lifetime, but rarely since her death. The idea of them spending extended time at the cabin, learning photography from him, represented a connection to future generations he hadn't allowed himself to envision. "They'd be bored out here," he said reflexively. "No shopping malls, no internet worth mentioning." "Actually, that's exactly why they want to come," Thomas countered. "Emma's doing an environmental science project for school, and Lily's been reading about wildlife conservation since I told them about your raccoon family. They're genuinely interested, Dad." Mason watched the last light fade from the sky, stars emerging in the clear autumn night. He thought of Emily's unfinished quilt, of patterns continuing through different hands, of knowledge and passion passing from one generation to the next, not as exact replication, but as evolution, adaptation. "Would need to clean up the guest room," he said finally. "Been using it for storage since your mother passed." Thomas's relief was audible. "We can help with that. Maybe come up for a weekend this fall to start getting things ready." After ending the call, Mason remained on the porch, contemplating this unexpected new direction. Teaching his granddaughters photography would require patience, energy, a willingness to share both expertise and the private sanctuary his property had become. It would mean opening himself to connection in ways he'd resisted since Emily's death. It would mean fully living again. A sound from the forest edge interrupted his thoughts, a familiar chittering that sent his pulse quickening. Mason remained perfectly still, hardly daring to hope as he peered into the darkness beyond his porch light's reach. Movement resolved into form as Bandit emerged cautiously from the underbrush, her injured paw held slightly off the ground but otherwise moving with reasonable comfort. The bandage Dr. Carlson had applied was gone, probably removed by the raccoon's own fastidious grooming, but the wound appeared to be healing without obvious infection. Behind her came the kits, Scout leading as usual, followed by Rascal, Peanut, and Emily, their grown bodies now nearly indistinguishable from adult raccoons except to Mason's practiced eye, which recognized their individual movement patterns and markings. Guardian brought up the rear, his larger form moving with the alert vigilance that had earned him his name. The Raccoon family approached no further than the edge of the clearing, maintaining a wild animal's prudent distance from human habitation. But their presence, their deliberate visibility, felt purposeful, as if they had come to check on Mason just as he had checked on them after their release. "Hello there," he said softly, remaining seated to appear less threatening. "Good to see you looking better, Bandit." The raccoons made no move to approach closer, but neither did they retreat. For several minutes they remained at the forest boundary, occasionally chittering quietly among themselves, their masked faces turned toward the porch where Mason sat, motionless. It was Guardian who finally broke the tableau, chittering what sounded remarkably like a command to the others before turning back toward the forest. One by one, the kits followed, disappearing into the darkness with the silent efficiency of wild creatures returning to their element. Bandit remained longest, her dark eyes reflecting the porch light as she seemed to study Mason one final time. Then she too turned, her injured paw now bearing weight more confidently, and vanished into the night forest that was her true home. Mason released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The visit felt like closure, not an ending but an acknowledgement of transition. The Raccoon family would continue their wild lives, perhaps visiting occasionally but no longer dependent on his care or documentation. Their story with him had reached its natural conclusion, while their own story continued beyond his observation. And his story continued too, evolving in directions he hadn't anticipated. National Geographic, the conservation easement, teaching his granddaughters, completing Emily's quilts, each thread connecting past to future through his present choices and actions. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, autumn asserting itself in the golden light and the mist rising from the valley below Mason's property. He rose early, completing his usual check of the soft release enclosure where fresh tracks confirmed the Raccoon family's visit had extended beyond their brief appearance on his porch. The supplementary food was gone, the water refreshed with rain from an overnight shower. Back at the cabin, Mason made his morning coffee and settled at his desk, opening his laptop to begin organizing the next phase of documentation. The Raccoon rehabilitation project might be complete, but the conservation monitoring continued. Camera traps recording wildlife movement through the protected corridor, seasonal observations documenting ecosystem health, ongoing advocacy, ensuring the easement remained protected. He worked steadily through the morning, pausing occasionally to rest his eyes or stretch his increasingly stiff shoulders. Age was asserting itself more insistently these days, his body reminding him of limitations his mind sometimes forgot. But there was a difference between acknowledging limitations and surrendering to them, a distinction Emily had modeled during her illness, accepting necessary accommodations while refusing to be defined by restriction. Around noon, Nancy's familiar knock announced her arrival for their now regular lunch date, an arrangement that had evolved gradually from her checking on him after Emily's death to a genuine friendship built on shared history and mutual respect. "Brought chicken salad," she announced, holding up a covered dish as he opened the door, "and sourdough from that new bakery in town." They ate on the back porch, enjoying the autumn sunshine while Nancy updated him on community news, the proposed expansion of the elementary school library, Reverend Jenkins' retirement announcement, the planning committee's debate over holiday decorations for the town square. "Heard the National Geographic people were out here yesterday," she mentioned casually, though Mason suspected she'd been waiting for the right moment to inquire. "How'd that go?" "Fine," Mason replied, then caught himself falling into his habitual terseness. Making an effort toward greater openness, he added, "Actually, it was good. Made me think about things differently." Nancy raised an eyebrow, inviting elaboration without demanding it. "Been focused on what's ending," Mason explained, surprising himself with the insight that formed as he spoke. "The Raccoon project, Emily's life, my career, but there's still plenty continuing, just in different forms. Like that quilt you're working on, Nancy suggested. Emily's pattern, your stitches. Mason nodded, appreciating her immediate understanding. Exactly that. And Thomas called last night. Wants to bring the granddaughters out next summer. Teach them photography. Nancy's face brightened with genuine pleasure. Mason, that's wonderful. Those girls are at the perfect age to develop a real appreciation for what you do. If they don't get bored after the first day, Mason cautioned, though without his former pessimism. Different generation, used to constant entertainment. You underestimate them, Nancy countered. And yourself. You've got a lifetime of knowledge to share, and they've got their grandmother's curiosity in them. I saw it last Christmas when they were asking about my garden design. After Nancy departed, Mason returned to his documentation work, but found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to the summer photography lessons Nancy's comment had evoked. What would he teach his granddaughters first? The technical aspects of exposure and composition, the patience required for wildlife observation, the ethical considerations of documenting without disturbing. Emily would have suggested starting with the emotional connection, helping the girls discover what aspects of nature spoke to them personally, then building technical skills around that core interest. She had always understood that technical proficiency without passionate engagement produced competent but soulless images. The afternoon passed quickly, Mason alternating between practical tasks and planning for this unexpected future project. As sunset approached, he found himself drawn to the sewing room, where Emily's quilt awaited his continuing work. He settled into her chair, threading the needle with greater confidence than he'd felt initially, and resumed the border pattern where he'd left off. His stitches would never match Emily's perfect regularity, but they were improving, becoming not an imitation of her technique, but a complementary variation recognizably derived from her example while reflecting his different hand. The wedding quilt would be completed in time for their niece's ceremony next spring, a gift representing both Emily's original intention and Mason's continuation of her work. As twilight deepened outside the windows, Mason became aware of movement at the forest edge, the now familiar silhouettes of the Raccoon family emerging for their evening foraging. Through the sewing room window, he watched them move with the confident efficiency of wild creatures in their element, Bandit's injured paw showing continued improvement as she led her family across the clearing toward the soft-release enclosure where supplementary food awaited. Mason remained at the quilt, observing without interrupting their natural behavior. The raccoons completed their business efficiently, disappearing back into the forest within minutes, unaware or unconcerned that their former caretaker witnessed their brief visit. As it should be, Mason thought, returning his attention to the stitching before him. Their lives continuing parallel to his, connected by experience, but appropriately separate. That night, Mason dreamed of Emily walking beside him along the forest path behind their cabin. Unlike previous dreams where she appeared as she had before illness claimed her, this Emily reflected her actual final months, thinner, hair cropped short after chemotherapy, moving with the careful conservation of energy that had characterized her last weeks. Yet her eyes remained bright with the intelligence and humor that cancer had never dimmed. "You're doing well," Dream Emily told him, pausing to examine a trillium blooming beside the path. "Better than I expected, honestly." "Took me long enough," Mason replied in the dream, aware he was dreaming but grateful for the conversation nonetheless. Emily straightened, fixing him with the penetrating gaze that had always seen through his defenses. "Grief isn't something to rush through, Mason. It takes the time it takes." "Miss you every day," he admitted, the dream state allowing an emotional directness he rarely managed while awake. "But it's different now. Less like drowning, more like carrying something precious that weighs a lot but is worth the effort." Dream Emily smiled, the expression transforming her thin face back to the vibrant woman he'd first fallen in love with decades ago. That's a good way to think of it. Now, tell me about our granddaughters coming to visit. The dream shifted then, Emily walking beside him as he showed her the changes to the property, the conservation easement boundaries, the places where he'd documented the Raccoon family's activities. She listened with the attentive interest she'd always shown in his work, asking perceptive questions, offering occasional insights that highlighted connections he'd missed. As they returned to the cabin in the dream, Emily paused at the edge of the clearing much as Bandit had done the previous evening. "I need to go now," she said, her form beginning to fade into the surrounding forest. "But you're going to be all right, Mason." "Better than all right." "How can you be sure?" he asked, trying to hold on to the dream as it began dissolving around him. Emily's voice came clearly even as her image faded completely. "Because you've remembered how to continue the pattern, even when it changes." Mason woke with the first light of dawn, the dream lingering with unusual clarity. He lay still for several minutes, holding the experience in mind, not with desperate clutching, but with appreciation for the insight his unconscious had offered through Emily's familiar voice. The day developed its own rhythm as Mason moved between documentation work, preparation for Thomas's weekend visit, and progress on the quilt. By late afternoon he felt a familiar restlessness, the need for movement, for direct engagement with the natural world that had been his professional focus for decades. The forest trails behind his cabin formed a network he knew intimately, paths Emily and he had established over years of exploration and observation. Mason selected his favorite route, one that circled through varied habitats before returning to the cabin, about an hour's walk at his current pace, challenging enough to feel like exercise without straining his cardiac limitations. Rusty accompanied him, as always, the old dog moving more slowly these days, but still eager for their daily excursions. Mason carried his camera out of habit, though he had no specific photographic intention beyond the pleasure of seeing through the lens that had defined his way of experiencing the world for most of his life. The forest welcomed them with the subtle drama of mid-autumn, maple leaves turning crimson and gold, beech trees fading to warm bronze, the understory rich with the earthy scent of decomposition that promised next spring's renewal. Mason moved at an unhurried pace, pausing occasionally to photograph interesting fungi, unusual light patterns, or animal signs that caught his attention. Near the small stream that marked the halfway point of his circuit, Mason noticed fresh raccoon tracks in the mud, likely his rehabilitated family, judging by the size variation and the slightly irregular print from Bandit's injured paw. He photographed these meticulously, adding to his documentation of their movement patterns since release. As he straightened from this task, a flash of movement caught his attention further upstream. Mason froze instinctively, the wildlife photographer's trained response to potential subject sighting. Rusty sensed his alertness and stopped as well, standing motionless beside his master. Patience rewarded them moments later when Guardian emerged from the underbrush on the opposite bank, moving with purpose toward the water's edge. The male raccoon paused, scanning his surroundings with the vigilance that characterized his species, before beginning to wash something in the stream, behavior Mason had documented repeatedly during rehabilitation. He raised his camera slowly, framing the scene with practiced precision. The lighting was challenging, dappled forest shade creating high contrast, but decades of experience guided his exposure adjustments automatically. Mason captured a series of images as Guardian completed his washing ritual and retreated into the underbrush, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. Only when the raccoon had vanished did Mason review the images on his camera's display. They were good, technically sound, capturing behavior in natural context without disturbing the subject. But one frame stood out, not for its technical perfection but for its narrative content. Guardian looking directly at the camera, awareness evident in his posture, choosing to continue his activity despite recognizing Mason's presence. It was a moment of mutual acknowledgement between species, captured in pixels, but representing something beyond digital information. This was why Mason had become a wildlife photographer, to document these fleeting connections, these glimpses across the boundaries that separated human from wild. "Still got it, Em," he murmured, knowing she would have appreciated both the image and the moment it represented. The remainder of the walk passed without further wildlife encounters, but Mason returned to the cabin feeling renewed in a way that transcended physical exercise. The raccoon sighting, brief as it was, had reconnected him to his core identity, not just as Emily's widower or the man who rehabilitated a raccoon family, but as a witness to the natural world, a documenter of its patterns and connections. That evening, as Mason prepared for Thomas's arrival the following day, he found himself contemplating the changes of the past year with new perspective. Grief remained, would always remain in some form, but it had transformed from all-consuming fog to weather that moved through his life, sometimes heavy, sometimes light, but no longer defining the entire landscape. The raccoon family had been unexpected guides through this transition, their journey from dependency to independence paralleling his own emergence from the initial paralysis of loss. He had helped them heal and return to their natural lives. They had helped him remember his purpose and connection to the world beyond his private pain. As darkness settled over the forest, Mason sat on his back porch with Emily's photograph beside him on the small table. "We did good work together," he told her image, "and I'm finding ways to continue it, even if the pattern's changing." The breeze stirred the trees at the forest edge, carrying the night sounds of his mountain home. A distant owl, rustling leaves, the gentle gurgle of the stream where Guardian had washed his food earlier that day. Mason listened, truly listened, as he hadn't been able to in the months following Emily's death, when grief had muffled his connection to everything outside its boundaries. The world continued its patterns, seasonal, daily, moment by moment, and he continued within it, changed by loss, but not ended by it, finding new threads to weave into the ongoing fabric of life. Tomorrow Thomas would arrive, bringing the practical energy of the younger generation and plans for future connection. The National Geographic feature would eventually share the raccoon family's story with a wider audience. The conservation easement would protect their habitat for generations to come. And Mason would continue his own pattern, documenting, witnessing, connecting, changed by experience but recognizable in essence. As Emily would have said, that was the nature of all living things, continuity through change, patterns evolving but never truly broken. From the forest edge came a familiar chittering, soft, brief, perhaps real or perhaps imagined. Mason smiled into the darkness, content with either possibility. Some connections transcended direct observation, existing in the patterns they created, rather than constant visible presence. "Good night out there," he said softly to the night forest and all it contained. "See you in the morning." 1 year after first hearing that distinctive chittering cry at the edge of his property, Mason Miller stood on his back porch in the warm glow of a July sunrise. The morning air carried the verdant scent of summer forest, rich with life and possibility. At 73, Mason's frame remained lean, but had lost the gaunt hollowness that had characterized his early widowhood. Regular walks, purposeful work, and, most significantly, the return of appetite for both food and life had restored a measure of vitality to his weathered features. Rusty dozed at his feet, the old retriever's muzzle now completely white, his movements increasingly stiff, but his loyalty unwavering. From inside the cabin came the muted sounds of teenage girls preparing for the day, cabinet doors opening and closing, water running, occasional bursts of laughter or good-natured bickering. Emma and Lily, his granddaughters, were in the third week of their summer visit, their initial city-bred hesitancy about the rustic cabin having evolved into comfortable familiarity. Mason sipped his coffee, watching the forest edge for movement, a habitual vigilance developed during months of raccoon rehabilitation and maintained through the year that followed. Though sightings had become increasingly rare as spring progressed into summer, he knew the raccoon family remained in the protected corridor. Camera traps captured occasional images of them, Bandit's injured paw fully healed, the kits now indistinguishable from adult raccoons except to Mason's practiced eye, Guardian still maintaining his unusual association with the family group. "Grandpa?" Emma's voice came from the doorway behind him. At 16, she had inherited her grandmother's analytical mind and her father's pragmatic approach to challenges. "Can we take the North Trail this morning?" "I want to check if that fox den is still active." Mason turned, noting the camera equipment Emma had already assembled, a modified version of his own field kit, tailored to her smaller frame but containing professional-grade equipment. The girl had shown remarkable aptitude for wildlife photography, absorbing technical instruction quickly while developing her own distinctive perspective. "North Trail works," he agreed. "Need to check the camera traps up that way anyhow." Emma nodded, her expression serious as she mentally reviewed the day's plan. "Should I pack lunch? Might take longer if we're checking all the traps." "Good thinking. Ask your sister to help. She knows where everything is." As Emma disappeared back into the cabin, Mason reflected on the unexpected joy of these weeks with his granddaughters. Thomas had brought them for a weekend in early June, ostensibly to prepare the cabin for their extended visit, but primarily to ease the transition for both Mason and the girls. That initial visit had been tentative, all parties navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. The girls encountering their grandfather as teacher rather than occasional holiday visitor, Mason assuming responsibility for teenage girls for the first time since Emily's death. But the weekend had exceeded everyone's expectations. Emma had immediately connected with Mason's wildlife photography, revealing an interest and aptitude that had previously gone unnoticed in the urban environment of Charlotte. 14-year-old Lily, though less technically inclined, had shown surprising skill in spotting wildlife and tracking animal signs. By Sunday afternoon, the original 2-week visit had been extended to a month, with Thomas promising to join them for the final weekend in July. Now, 3 weeks into this grand experiment, Mason marveled at how naturally they had established routines and shared interests. Mornings were devoted to photography expeditions, each day exploring different trails and habitats across Mason's property and the adjacent conservation easement. Afternoons typically involved reviewing and editing their images, with Mason providing technical guidance while encouraging the girls to develop their own artistic vision. Evenings brought shared meals, cooking responsibilities rotating between them, followed by reading or board games or stargazing from the back porch. The cabin itself had been transformed by their presence. Guest rooms, long used for storage, had been cleared and refreshed with new bedding in the girls' preferred colors. Emily's sewing room, while still housing her equipment and Mason's ongoing quilt projects, now also contained a small desk where Lily worked on her nature journal, documenting their daily observations with both scientific precision and artistic flair. The refrigerator displayed Emma's best photographs alongside Lily's sketches, evidence of growing skill and confidence in their respective media. Most significantly, the cabin had regained the quality that had defined it during Emily's lifetime. It had become a home again, filled with conversation and occasional disagreements and shared discoveries. The girls had brought life back into spaces that had grown too quiet, too still, too haunted by absence. Lily joined her sister and grandfather on the porch, carrying the backpack they used for day hikes. At 14, she showed signs of developing her grandmother's willowy height, though her features favored Thomas's side of the family. "Lunch is packed," she reported. Sandwiches, apples, and those oatmeal cookies Nancy brought yesterday, and I filled all the water bottles. Good job, Mason approved. Got your journal? Lily patted the smaller bag slung across her body. Always, and my plant identification cards. I'm hoping to find that trillium variety we talked about yesterday. The North Trail led them deeper into the forest than the girls had yet ventured, climbing gradually through changing vegetation zones as it approached the eastern boundary of Mason's property. Emma walked slightly ahead, camera ready, pausing occasionally to photograph interesting fungi or light patterns through the canopy. Lily kept pace with Mason, her observant gaze constantly scanning the forest floor for plant specimens or animal signs. "There's raccoon tracks," she noted about 20 minutes into their hike, pointing to distinctive prints in a muddy section of trail. "Fresh ones, from this morning." Mason examined the tracks with practiced eye. "Good catch. And you're right about timing, still sharp-edged, no leaf litter fallen into them." "Is it them, your raccoon family?" Lily asked, already kneeling to sketch the prints in her journal. "Might be. Right size range, and look here." Mason pointed to one print slightly different from the others. "This one's right front paw has a distinctive scar pattern. Could be bandit." Emma had doubled back at their conversation, her camera already documenting the tracks from various angles. "Should we follow them? Maybe we could photograph them in the wild." Mason considered the suggestion, weighing educational opportunity against ethical wildlife practice. "We can check the direction, but we won't actively track them. Wild raccoons deserve their space, especially ones that have history with humans." The tracks led toward a nearby stream, logical raccoon behavior seeking water and the crayfish or frogs that might provide breakfast. Mason guided the girls to a vantage point where they could observe the stream without approaching directly, using the opportunity to discuss wildlife observation ethics. "Always give animals an escape route," he explained as they settled behind a fallen log overlooking the small waterway. "Never position yourself between them and safety, and keep your voices low. Animals respond to tone more than volume." For nearly 20 minutes, they maintained patient silence, watching the stream for activity. Mason felt a surge of pride at the girls' stillness, a difficult discipline for teenagers accustomed to constant stimulation and movement. Emily would have appreciated their growing appreciation for patient observation, the cornerstone of both wildlife photography and genuine conservation ethics. Their patience was rewarded when a single raccoon emerged from the underbrush downstream, not Bandit or her family, but a younger male Mason hadn't documented before. The girls remained perfectly still as Mason whispered minimal guidance, settings adjustments for Emma's camera, behavioral notes for Lily's journal. The raccoon proceeded with its morning activities unaware of its human observers, providing a perfect demonstration of successful wildlife photography practices. Only after the animal departed did Mason allow conversation to resume, the girls bubbling with excitement over their successful observation. As they continued their hike toward the camera traps, Mason found himself reflecting on how naturally he had settled into the teaching role, sharing knowledge accumulated over decades of wildlife photography while learning from the fresh perspectives his granddaughters brought to familiar landscapes. "Grandpa, was it hard?" Emma asked suddenly as they climbed a steeper section of trail. "Letting the raccoons go after taking care of them for so long?" The question caught Mason by surprise, not its content but its insight. The girls knew the raccoon rehabilitation story from Thomas and the preliminary National Geographic materials, but neither had directly addressed the emotional aspect of the experience. "It was," Mason admitted after a thoughtful pause. "Harder than I expected. You get attached, even when you're trying to maintain professional distance." "Like us going home next week," Lily suggested quietly. "Even though we know we're supposed to go back to Charlotte, it'll be hard to leave." Mason glanced at his younger granddaughter, struck by the perceptive connection she'd drawn. "Something like that. though you two will be coming back for Thanksgiving, so it's not a permanent goodbye." "The raccoons came back too," Emma pointed out. "Not the same way, but they still visit sometimes." "They do," Mason agreed, impressed by both girls' emotional intelligence, another quality they seemed to have inherited from their grandmother. "And that's the right balance with wild things. You care about them, you protect their habitat when you can, but you respect their wildness too." The conversation continued as they reached the first camera trap, Mason demonstrating how to check the memory card and reset the equipment without disturbing the surrounding habitat. Both girls absorbed the technical instruction eagerly, taking turns practicing the procedure at subsequent trap locations. At the most remote camera, positioned near the boundary of the conservation easement, they discovered unusual activity. The camera had been dislodged from its mounting, though not damaged, and lay on the ground amid scattered debris. "Bear, probably," Mason explained as he examined the scene. "Curious about the unfamiliar object. Happens occasionally." Emma helped him reset and secure the camera while Lily documented the bear signs in her journal. The memory card revealed the culprit, a young black bear investigating the strange device, its expression almost comically confused before it batted the camera from its mount. "Lunch spot's just ahead," Mason told them as they finished the repair. "Nice view of the valley from there." The overlook had been one of Emily's favorite places, a natural stone outcropping providing panoramic views of the surrounding mountains and the small town nestled in the valley below. Mason had avoided it during the worst months of grief, finding the expansive beauty too painful without Emily beside him to share it. But today, spreading their lunch on the sun-warmed stone while his granddaughters exclaimed over the vista, he felt only quiet appreciation for the memories the place held. "Grandma used to bring me here when I was really little," Emma recalled, unwrapping her sandwich. "She knew all the bird calls. She'd close her eyes and tell me exactly what was singing and where it was perched. Had the best ear for bird calls of anyone I've known," Mason confirmed. "Could distinguish between individual mockingbirds by the slight variations in their songs." "Did she take pictures too?" Lily asked. "Or just go with you on your photography trips?" "She took pictures sometimes, but mostly she observed in other ways. Writing, sketching, just sitting and watching. Said she didn't need to capture everything, just experience it fully in the moment." The girls considered this perspective, so different from their generation's instinct to document every experience through smartphone cameras and social media posts. Mason could almost see them processing the concept, fitting it into their evolving understanding of the grandmother they'd lost too young and the natural world they were now exploring through her husband's guidance. "I think I understand that," Lily said finally. "It's like my journal. Sometimes I'm so busy trying to get every detail written down that I miss just feeling what it's like to be here." Mason nodded, recognizing Emily's contemplative nature emerging in her younger granddaughter. "Balance is the trick. Documenting has value, creates records, helps others see what you've seen. But direct experience matters too." "Is that why you took a break from professional photography after Grandma died?" Emma asked, her directness reminiscent of Thomas at the same age. "Because it didn't feel right to keep documenting without experiencing?" The question penetrated deeper than the teenager likely intended, touching on truths Mason had only recently begun to acknowledge to himself. For months after Emily's death, he had barely lifted his camera, finding no purpose in documenting a world that no longer contained her. The raccoon rehabilitation had gradually reawakened his photographer's eye, but with a different quality, more intimate, more connected to the subjects, less focused on creating marketable images. "Something like that," he acknowledged. "Your grandmother was always my connection to the meaning behind the images. Without her, it took me a while to find that meaning again." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they finished lunch, the girls sharing stories from school and asking Mason about his earlier wildlife expeditions. By the time they packed up to return to the cabin, the afternoon had advanced, golden summer light filtering through the forest canopy as they descended the trail. They were perhaps 15 minutes from home when Rusty, who had been ambling contentedly alongside them, suddenly raised his head alertly. The old dog's ears perked forward, his body tensing with focus toward a dense thicket beside the trail. Mason signaled the girls to stop, recognizing Rusty's hunting instinct activating after decades of accompanying him on wildlife expeditions. Emma already had her camera raised, anticipating potential action, while Lily froze in place, her journal half open in her hands. The forest fell silent except for the gentle rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. Then came the sound Mason had been unconsciously waiting for since the morning, a soft, distinctive chittering that sent immediate recognition through his body. "Raccoons," he whispered to the girls. "Stay completely still." The thicket parted slightly as a familiar masked face emerged. Bandit, her coat glossy in health, her movements displaying the confident wariness of a wild animal in its element. She paused at the edge of the vegetation, dark eyes scanning the trail and its human occupants with clear recognition. Mason felt his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Though camera traps had confirmed the Raccoon family's continued presence in the protected corridor, direct sightings had become increasingly rare as they readapted fully to wild living. This encounter, with his granddaughters as witnesses, felt purposeful somehow, a connection across species and generations. Bandit chittered again, the sound answered from within the thicket by multiple responses. One by one, her nearly grown offspring emerged briefly beside her: Scout, Rascal, Peanut, and Emily. Their individual markings still recognizable to Mason, though they now matched their mother in size. They appeared healthy and alert, successfully transitioned to independent wild living while maintaining their family bonds. Guardian was the last to appear, his larger form materializing from deeper forest to stand slightly apart from, but clearly associated with the family group. The male raccoon's posture suggested protective vigilance, yet without fear or aggression toward the humans on the trail. For nearly a minute the tableau held, 3 humans and 1 elderly dog observing 5 raccoons across a small clearing, mutual awareness acknowledged without either approach or retreat. Mason remained motionless, peripherally aware of Emma's camera silently capturing the moment and Lily's hand moving almost imperceptibly across her journal page. Then, with the same mysterious communication that characterized many of their behaviors, the Raccoon family melted back into the forest as one unit. Their departure left the clearing empty, yet somehow still inhabited by the significance of the encounter. "That was them, wasn't it?" Emma whispered, lowering her camera with reverent care. "Your Raccoon family." Mason nodded, finding his voice slightly unsteady. "That was them. All doing well from the look of it." "They recognized you?" Lily stated with absolute certainty. "The mother, Bandit. She knew exactly who you were." "Possibly," Mason allowed, unwilling to project human qualities onto wild behavior, yet equally unwilling to dismiss the apparent recognition he'd observed. "Raccoons have excellent memories, especially for food sources and threats. I represented both safety and eventual release for them." "It's more than that," Lily insisted with the confidence of youth. "They came to show you they're okay, and to meet us." Mason didn't contradict her, recognizing that sometimes a 14-year-old's intuitive understanding might capture emotional truths that scientific objectivity missed. Emily would have sided with Lily on this interpretation, finding meaning in the timing and nature of the encounter rather than dismissing it as coincidence. The remainder of the walk passed in thoughtful conversation, the girls processing the raccoon sighting through their different perspectives. Emma analyzing the photographic evidence, Lily developing a more narrative interpretation in her journal. Mason listened more than he spoke, appreciating their engaging minds and fresh insights. Back at the cabin, the afternoon unfolded according to their established routine, downloading and reviewing the day's photographs, updating journals and documentation, preparing dinner together in the kitchen that had once again become the heart of the household. But beneath the familiar activities ran an undercurrent of significance, all three aware that they had shared something extraordinary on the forest trail. After dinner, as twilight settled over the mountain, they migrated naturally to the back porch. Emma brought her laptop to review the raccoon photographs, while Lily added watercolor to her journal sketches of the encounter. Mason settled into his usual chair, Rusty at his feet, watching his granddaughters with quiet appreciation. "These turned out better than I hoped," Emma said, turning her laptop screen to show a particularly striking image of Bandit and Guardian standing side by side at the forest edge. "The lighting was challenging, but you can see their expressions so clearly." Mason studied the photograph with professional assessment and personal connection. "Excellent composition. You captured their relationship. See how their bodies are angled slightly toward each other despite maintaining separate vigilance?" Emma beamed at the specific praise. "I was trying to show exactly that, the way they're together but still independent. That's what makes wildlife photography an art, not just documentation," Mason told her. "Capturing those relationships, those moments that reveal something about the subjects beyond just their physical appearance." "Do you think they're still a family?" Lily asked, looking up from her journal where she'd created a detailed rendering of the raccoon group. "Even though the babies are grown now?" "Not typical raccoon behavior," Mason admitted. "Usually the young disperse after the first year, females establishing nearby territories, males traveling farther to prevent inbreeding. But this family has always shown unusual social bonds." "Because of what they went through together?" Emma suggested. "The rehabilitation experience?" Mason considered this thoughtfully. "Possibly. Or perhaps Guardian's continued presence created a different family structure. We're still learning about raccoon social dynamics in the wild." "I think they stayed together because they chose to," Lily said, with the simple certainty that sometimes characterized her observations. "Just like some human families stay close and others drift apart. They decided their family was worth keeping." The observation hung in the evening air, resonating beyond its immediate context to touch on the human family gathered on the porch, 3 generations connected by blood and choice, by shared experience and developing understanding. Mason thought of Thomas, arriving this weekend to complete their temporary family circle. Of Emily, present in the genetic inheritance visible in her granddaughter's features and thoughts. Of his own journey from isolated grief to renewed connection. "Your grandmother would have liked that interpretation," he told Lily with a smile that acknowledged both the scientific uncertainty and the emotional truth of her statement. "She always said families were created by choice as much as circumstance." The conversation drifted to plans for Thomas's arrival and their final days together before the girls returned to Charlotte. Emma mentioned the portfolio she was assembling from her summer photographs, while Lily described the nature journal presentations she planned for her science class in the fall. Mason listened with growing awareness of the legacy taking shape through these weeks together, not just photography skills or wildlife knowledge, but ways of seeing and being in the world that would continue through his granddaughters long after he was gone. Later that night, after the girls had retired to their rooms, Mason sat alone on the porch with Emily's photograph beside him. The raccoon encounter had stirred memories and emotions that sought expression, and he found himself talking softly to her image as had become his habit in moments of significance. "Saw the whole family today, Em? All healthy, all together still." The girls saw them too. Seemed almost like the raccoons came specifically to be seen. He chuckled softly. "Lily thinks it was deliberate, a kind of raccoon family reunion with the human family. You'd probably agree with her. The photograph captured Emily in her early 60s, laughing by the stream behind their cabin, silver-streaked hair catching sunlight, eyes crinkled with the joy that had characterized her approach to life even in its challenges. Mason studied the familiar features, feeling the usual ache of absence, but also the newer sense of continuing connection that had gradually emerged through the past year. The girls are doing well. Emma's got a real eye for composition, better than mine was at twice her age, and Lily sees connections everywhere just like you did. He paused, organizing thoughts that had been forming throughout the day. Think they'll carry something from this summer forward, something beyond just photography skills or nature facts, a way of seeing the world as interconnected, meaningful. Your way, really. The night breeze stirred the wind chimes Emily had hung years ago, creating gentle music that seemed to answer his reflections. Mason sat with the sound, appreciating the peace that had gradually replaced raw grief. Not its absence, but its transformation into something that could coexist with joy, with purpose, with continuation. The Raccoon family had been part of that transformation. Their journey from injured wildlife to rehabilitated wild creatures paralleling his own emergence from the isolation of early grief. Seeing them thriving in their natural habitat, maintaining their unusual family bonds while fully embracing their wild nature, felt like confirmation of possibilities Mason was only beginning to fully recognize in his own life. He wasn't just Emily's widower or the raccoon rehabilitator or even just a wildlife photographer. He was becoming something new that incorporated all these identities while extending beyond them, a grandfather passing knowledge to a new generation, a community member advocating for conservation, a man learning to live fully in the present while honoring the past. A sound from the forest edge drew his attention, the distinctive chittering that had become so familiar during the months of rehabilitation. Mason peered into the darkness, unable to discern shapes but certain of the sound's origin. The Raccoon family was out there, continuing their wild lives, occasionally intersecting with his in these moments of mutual recognition. "Good night out there," he called softly toward the sound. "Take care of each other." The chittering came once more, then faded into the night sounds of the forest. Mason remained on the porch a while longer, listening to the wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the gentle breathing of Rusty sleeping at his feet. The world continued its patterns, seasonal, daily, moment by moment, and he continued within it, changed by experience, but not ended by it, finding new threads to weave into the ongoing fabric of life. When he finally rose to return inside, Mason paused at the door, looking back at the forest that had been his and Emily's sanctuary, that had sheltered the Raccoon family, that would now provide exploration grounds for his granddaughters and future generations. The conservation easement ensured its protection, but the true preservation lay in the connections formed, the ongoing relationship between humans and wilderness that transcended individual lifespans. "We did good work together," he told the night sky where stars gleamed with eternal patience. And it continues, even when the pattern changes. Inside the cabin, Mason moved quietly past the girls' rooms where his granddaughters slept, past Emily's sewing room, where the wedding quilt neared completion, into his own room where photographs from multiple generations lined the walls. Tomorrow would bring more teaching, more exploration, more documentation of the world's beauty and complexity. The Raccoon family would continue their wild lives, perhaps occasionally intersecting with human observation, but fundamentally free and self-determined as they should be. And Mason would continue too, teaching, creating, connecting, his life no longer defined primarily by loss, but by the ongoing patterns of meaning he helped create and sustain. As Emily would have said, that was the nature of all living things, continuity through change, patterns evolving but never truly broken. In our golden years, life offers unexpected second chances if we remain open to them. Mason's journey shows us that grief doesn't end, it transforms, becoming part of a richer tapestry where joy can exist alongside loss. Like Mason, many of us face empty rooms and silent mornings after decades of shared lives. Yet in his story, we see our own possibilities, how helping a wounded creature healed his wounded heart, how sharing knowledge with grandchildren created purpose, how finishing his wife's quilt connected past to future. The Raccoon family's return visits remind us that bonds transcend circumstances. They may change form but never truly disappear. What matters isn't clinging to what was, but recognizing how past love shapes our continuing story. Our wisdom, earned through decades of living, becomes most valuable when shared with younger generations who see the world through fresh eyes. Mason discovered that happiness wasn't about erasing grief, but weaving it into a new pattern, one that honors what was lost while embracing what remains possible. Have you experienced an unexpected healing connection after loss? What wisdom are you passing to the next generation? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what another heart needs to hear today.